Chapter 768. He knew that He had already surrendered to the mercenaries, yet he still dared to say such words. It was obvious that he was looking down on He, but how could He be so easy to deal with? He didn't care about the other party's mockery, and said with a calm expression, "I am already a commander of the mercenaries. As for Agar Dorji, I have a clear conscience. I have already repaid him by exchanging my life for his son's." This was also the truth. He had indeed made this request, and Yang Qindong had also satisfied him. Otherwise, he would rather die in battle than surrender. Facing He's answer, Amu Gulong didn't comment. He seemed to know that there was no point in discussing this topic at this time. "All right, let's cut the crap. It's impossible to give up Talu City, since the Great Khan has arranged for me to guard this place. Unless I die, no one can occupy this place. Bring it on if you have the ability." After saying that, Amu Gulong waved the long sword in his hand, looking like he was about to block an army of 10,000. Facing Amu Gulong's desperate look, He shook her head, reined the horse, and turned back. Suddenly, she led the 3,000 cavalrymen of the Tatar cavalry regiment back, leaving the 5,000 cavalrymen of the other side, who had already set up the battle formation there. The mercenaries retreated just like that, leaving Amu Gulong puzzled. But the other party had already retreated, and it was a very orderly retreat. At this time, even if he rushed forward, he wouldn't be able to gain any advantage. So, he could only lead the 5,000 Tatar cavalry back to the city. "Congratulations, General!" Seeing Amu Gulong leading the army back to the city in one piece, the deputy general led his men to welcome him. He spoke with a happy face as soon as he saw Amu Gulong. Sigh. On the other hand, Amu Gulong didn't seem very happy. He just shook his head and said, "They won't give up on this place. There will be a big battle in the end. This time, they came just to test my thoughts. Next time, we will meet with weapons." Amu Gulong's guess was right. The reason why he retreated without even fighting was because he considered that the 6th young master had given him the first task of persuading the other party. Since it was obvious that he couldn't persuade them, he naturally had to send the news back first, and then prepare for battle. Yang Qindong was in the rear of the army following Tiger's Man and the independent regiment to Talu City. When the scouts at the front rushed back and reported that the generals of both sides had met but parted on bad terms, Tiger's Man immediately shouted, "Then let's fight." Do they really think that they are the best in the world just because they are guarding a broken city? If they provoke this daddy, I will blast their city gate with one shot. Let's see what they can be proud of. After obtaining the 100mm mortar, Tiger's Man's courage increased. A small Talu city with only 10,000 soldiers was really not in his eyes. Of course, shouting was one thing. Tiger's Man knew very well that in the end, it was still up to the 6th young master to make the decision. Therefore, after venting the emotions in his heart with a loud roar, he still looked at Yang Qindong with an expression of waiting for orders. "Go, do as you think." Yang Qindong nodded lightly. Although he was not a murderous person, he had never been lenient towards his opponents. "If you are not convinced, then I will beat you until you are. If you are still not convinced, then I will send you on your way." After receiving the order, Tiger's Man immediately stood at attention. "Young master, don't worry. Leave this battle to me. I will definitely not let you down." Ha ha ha. Tiger's Man had been by Yang Qindong's side since he was young. He had witnessed every scene of the young master growing from a weak scholar to a god of war. Although he did not understand why the young master changed his temperament and suddenly became so powerful and unfathomable, he still liked the current young master very much. Yang Qindong created the Yangxie regiment, which was why Tiger's Man had the power and influence. He knew that all of this was given to him by the young master, so he was absolutely loyal to young Chendong. He was the kind of existence that could block a bullet and die for him at any time. The sixth young master had the most important position in his heart. Next, it would depend on his performance in the army. Although the independent regiment was in the limelight recently, there were not many opportunities to perform. Now that the opportunity had come, how could he give it up? After receiving the order, he put on a white cloak and walked out of the temporary military tent. He called the deputy commander Exanhonghai and said, "Leave 2 battalions to protect the 6th young master's safety. The rest of you follow me and speed up. Let's try to reach Tulu City by nightfall today." It was only a distance of 30 miles from where they were to the city. If it was summer, it would take less than 2 hours, and a rapid march would be enough. But now there was snow everywhere, and most of the roads under their feet had just been cleared. Marching in such an environment, it was naturally impossible to go fast even if they wanted to. After receiving the order, the independent regiment sped up their march, leaving 2 battalions behind to protect young Chendong's safety. The other 14 battalions were all rushing forward. When they saw the troops flashing past them one after another, leaving behind a trail of shadows that disappeared in front of them, Beta Persei, who was standing beside young Chendong, asked with some confusion, "Young master, don't we have to go with them?" "There's no need for that. Just let them do whatever they want. No matter how strong a person is, he can't rule the world. What we need to do is to wait for the good news from the front." Young Chendong smiled with a very relieved look. This time, the number of mercenaries was not less than the other side, and they were accompanied by heavy weapons. If they still couldn't conquer the small Tulu city, it could only prove that Tiger's man and Suhi were not suitable to lead troops and could retire from active service immediately. Young Chendong believed in Tiger's man and Suhi, and the 2 of them also believed in the soldiers under them. Speaking of which, during this period of time, they had not been idle in the beginning city. They only rested for 1 day every 7 days to tidy up their internal affairs and wash up. The other 6 days were spent crawling until midnight to train. Often, when the soldiers were sleeping soundly, an emergency assembly whistle would wake everyone up from their warm beds and run to the field to start training. At first, everyone did not understand this kind of training. They thought that if they did not have a good night's sleep, how could they have the energy to train? However, when every meal was filled with delicious fish and meat, they had nothing to worry about. Their nutrition could keep up, and they realized that this kind of training was not unbearable. On the contrary, everyone put in all their effort, with the idea of sweating more during training and bleeding less during battle. Their strength increased day by day. When the individual strength of each soldier took a big step forward, the combat effectiveness of the entire army was a little terrifying. As the saying goes, soldiers are trained for 1,000 days to be used in a single moment. Now, it was finally time to perform well. It was finally time to fight for military merits. No one was willing to fall behind. Everyone wanted to have a better performance and fight for more advantages and benefits for their future. Young Chendong had always been willing to spend money. In the army, there were already rules that stated how many military merits could be obtained by killing a person. Under such stimulation, everyone only hated that there was no war to fight. How could they be afraid of war? After the military order was given, the horn of war was blown. The 14 battalions of the independent regiment rushed forward, giving people the feeling that they were afraid that if they were a step slower, they would not be able to make it in time for the great battle ahead and miss out on countless military merits. Under such an excited mood, supported by such strong confidence, more than 5,000 soldiers galloped forward on horseback. Once the snow was too heavy and their path was blocked, they would dismount and walk. In short, They had to reach the designated location as soon as possible and prepare for tomorrow's battle. Under Tulu City, it slowly became lively. The number of military tents under the city also began to increase one by one. Battalions of the independent regiment arrived and set up their tents. They lined up horizontally and vertically in an extremely orderly manner. There were also some people who began to cook. Smoke rose in spirals. Everything was so orderly that AMU Gulong, who was standing on the city gate tower, shook his head. The enemy is not panicking at all. Looks like we have to give up on the idea of taking advantage of the fact that they haven't stabilized their footing yet. That's right. Look at how their tents are arranged neatly like a line. One can imagine the battle prowess of such an army, she said from the side, her eyes filled with envy. Even a general would want to lead a strong army. And the mercenaries in front of them were clearly a strong army. Right, how is the morale of the army? After giving up on the idea of sneak attacking the enemy, AMU Gulong felt much more relaxed, as for the time being, he would be safe from now until tomorrow morning. He could temporarily relax. When the issue of morale was brought up, Shi Bei's expression became somewhat unsightly. Not too good. When the soldiers heard that they were mercenaries from the war god's army, many of them were very afraid. Fortunately, we have always treated our brothers well. Until now, there have been no signs of desertion. But if the enemy besieges the city, it will be hard to say as time goes on. Shi Bei was also an extremely capable general. It was just that as the deputy general of the city, he rarely had the opportunity to display his abilities, but he usually treated his brothers very well. It was precisely because of this that when a great battle came, his subordinates were still very obedient. Even when facing the legendary war god's army, there was no one who fled without a fight. It could be said that his prestige played a significant role in all of this, but prestige might be useful in the short term. Once the battle dragged on and the enemy besieged the city, the psychological pressure would become greater and greater. It was hard to say what would happen in the end. They won't besiege the city. If I'm not wrong, I'm afraid they will choose to attack the city tomorrow. AMU Gulong understood. With such heavy snow, if they didn't have a city to rely on and just camped in the wilderness like this for a long time, no one could guarantee that there wouldn't be any problems. Since the war god was so good at fighting, there was no way he wouldn't understand this. Chapter 769. Shibi did not say anything else. He was now a fish on the chopping block. The choice had already changed. All he could do was to fight with all his might when the enemy attacked the city. As for the rest, life and death were up to fate. In Tulu City, they did not choose to launch a sneak attack. This made Tiger's Mane, who was ready to give the enemy a heavy slap in the face, a little disappointed. Looking at the firearmed soldiers lying in ambush beside the tents, he waved his hand and said, "All right, the enemy will not come out. Everyone, go into the tents to keep warm. Come, inform the 6th young master that we have safely arrived at the city and are ready to attack tomorrow morning." Under Tulu City, swords were drawn and bows were bent. It looked like a war would break out at any time. It was dark. At the rear of the army, Lu Shua's 2nd Cavalry Regiment was also rushing to clear the road. According to Yang Qindong's intention, they wanted to open up a wide road from the first city to Tulu City. This would be beneficial for the communication between the two sides. At critical times, it would also be beneficial for the mutual support of the army. At this time, the road that the army was clearing had already reached the area controlled by Saihan Mountain. The intelligence from the reconnaissance camp had already shown that there was a Tatar army of tens of thousands of people here. Previously, they were the ones who pulled water from Alahomiki City, which was not the first city yet. Because of this, they were tricked by the mercenaries. But for some reason, since the establishment of the first city, they had not made any military movements. They seemed to be very tolerant. A dog that bites does not bark. This was an old saying among the people. When completing this mission, Yang Qindong had told Lu Zhuo that they must not be careless and give the enemy a chance to attack them. Therefore, when they arrived at this area, the 2nd Cavalry Regiment's vigilance was raised a lot. The original sentries were also spread out for 2 miles to ensure that no matter if the enemy approached, they would be able to detect them early and make timely preparations. Inform the 3 new regiments that it is getting dark. Prepare to set up military tents. Inform the cooks in each battalion to prepare for dinner. Lu Zhuo rode on his war horse and looked at the 6,000 new recruits who were waving their shovels and brooms as he gave the order. The performance of these 6,000 recruits was pretty good. At least they didn't seem to be slacking off. Speaking of which, to be able to join the army at this time, which one of them wasn't working hard. After all, there were still 7,000 captives from the battle with Agador. In terms of combat power, they were much stronger than the new recruits. If it wasn't for the issue of loyalty, where would the 6,000 new recruits come from? They were worried that once the 7,000 captives were released, they would become a mainstream force and disrupt the current management model of the mercenaries. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that each of these 6,000 people was very precious. They had made countless comparisons before they got what they wanted. Such a rare opportunity. Of course, everyone wanted to grasp it well. This was also their first mission. Although they appeared as coolies, every new recruit still worked hard to perform, hoping to leave a good impression on their superiors. The sky was getting dark, and some work couldn't be done. Lu Zhuo gave the order for the new regiments to rest, but as the commander, he couldn't rest. He called his 3 battalion commanders, Ma Xiangshan, Ding Shan, Teimu, the 4 of us will have to work hard tonight. We will take turns to be on night duty. Is there a problem with each of us working for 4 hours? No problem. The 3 battalion commanders immediately patted their chests and promised. Inside the tent, a stove had already been lit. The warmth of spring here and the freezing cold outside formed an extremely obvious contrast and difference. At this time, Yang Qindong was sitting beside the stove, looking at the telegrams sent from Qiqian City. Ever since the incident with Yang Taizhu and Chen Shuquan, Qiqian City had used this opportunity to conduct a large-scale investigation. The future 6th Madam, Luan Xiaoyu, was in charge. Security Bureau Chief Yang San, Inspector Bureau Chief Xinyu, Political Department Member Mo Chengyu, and Navy 1st Division Commander Gao Xiong formed a team of 5 to cooperate. Handing such an important task to Luan Xiaoyu, it was impossible to say that Yang Qindong wasn't worried at all. After all, she was just a girl, and she was only 16 years old. A girl. And so young. Could she bear such a heavy burden? But Yang Qindong still made this decision, and this was because of Luan Xiaoyu's special identity. First, she was the future 6th Madam. This meant that Luan Xiaoyu didn't have to worry too much about doing things. Even if someone wanted to deal with her, they had to consider the consequences of angering Yang Qindong. Second, as a native of Qiqian City, her parents were both factory executives. This allowed Luan Xiaoyu to have a deeper understanding of many things in Qiqian City. This was something that the other madams couldn't compare to. Thirdly, letting a little girl do this would make it easier for others to have the idea of underestimating the enemy. If this was the case, it would be equivalent to losing a round before the battle, because at any time, underestimating the opponent could bring about irreversible consequences. Fourth, and the most important point, ever since Luan Xiaoyu became the head of Qiqian City's publicity department, her performance in all aspects was excellent. She had already shown management skills that didn't match her age. This was also why Yang Qindong thought highly of her. Since she could manage the publicity department so well, she could probably complete the self-inspection mission beautifully. And the facts also proved that Yang Qindong's judgment of people was very accurate. Since the beginning of the operation, everything went smoothly. From the telegram sent, from the beginning of the operation until now, they had already investigated various local and military problems. There were 134 cadres, and this number was still expanding. It seemed that there was no end to it. Among these cadres, some had been arrested for corruption, some had abused their power for personal gain, and some had even used their power to abuse their power. For example, they had coerced other women to serve them, and then they would get a good job in exchange for sleeping with them, and so on. Needless to say, as a woman, Wan Xiaoyu was naturally very angry about this. As long as there was such a leader, once they fell into his hands, he wouldn't even bat an eyelid when arresting people. Sigh. Gently putting down the telegram in his hand, Yang Qindong sighed from his mouth. Qiqian City had only been established for a short period of time, and there were already so many internal problems. This was under Yang Qindong's high salary. It could be imagined that if the salary wasn't high, the number of criminals would be more than doubled. Qiqian City was only a part of an island, and that was it. One could imagine what the officials of the great Ming dynasty were like. The so-called a year of honest magistrate, 100,000 snowflakes silver, was probably the most appropriate description. Yang Qindong was still thinking about some related problems when the curtain of the military tent was pushed open from the outside. Beta Persei, Taihu, Baizhua, and the others walked in. Suddenly, the military tent became a lot more lively. Everyone is here, find a place to sit. Looking at these elites under his command, Yang Qindong's face showed a smile. Everyone was the first to follow Yang Qindong, so they didn't treat him as an outsider. They each found a place near the stove and sat down. Then they looked at the sixth young master with an expectant look. They knew that there must be something important to discuss, because in the past, when everyone appeared together, there would be more important tasks to carry out. Since they weren't outsiders, Yang Qindong didn't beat around the bush and directly said, "Tiger's Mane has already led the army to Tulu City. If nothing unexpected happens, there will be a good result tomorrow. Perhaps at this time tomorrow, we will be staying in the city, taking down Tulu City in one day." If someone else said this, they might not believe it, but since it came from Yang Qindong, Taihu and the others had no reason to doubt it. Their sixth young master was like this. Once he said something, he would always be able to quickly fulfill it. Yang Qindong had never thought that taking down Tulu City would be difficult. The difficult part was that he would have to enter the capital of Ming. Although he had the powerful trump card of Daikra, he shouldn't be afraid of any danger. This Daikra was very mysterious and could make him disappear into thin air, just in case. But in the end, he was still a man, not a god. What if he was caught off guard, for example, when he was sleeping at night and his head was cut off? Even if he had Daikra, he wouldn't be able to change the outcome of his death. Although Yang Qindong's perception of danger had reached a whole new level due to the existence of the qi in his heart, and it should have been very difficult for anyone to kill him. However, there was always a chance, and Yang Qindong didn't want to gamble. This was also why he had asked Yang Heir to call Taihu and Baizhua over. After taking down Tulu City, I plan to celebrate the new year in the capital of Ming. There are some things that have to be resolved. Now, I want you to accompany me to the capital. How about it? Are there any difficulties? Yang Qindong still looked at Taihu and Baizhua with a smile. Although he said that he was asking, he was actually informing them. Not many people knew that Yang Qindong was going to Ming to celebrate the new year. For example, in the first city, only Yumian knew. tiger's mane, and Beta Persei already knew. Therefore, when they heard this news, Tai Hu and Bai Zhuo were stunned. It was precisely because they had followed Yang Qindong for a long time that they knew better than anyone else what kind of attitude Bai Ming had towards the sixth young master. In a sense, Yang Qindong would be the person who would overthrow the great Ming dynasty. This could already be seen from the various signs he had shown. And for such a person, there were probably many people in Bai Ming and southern Ming who wanted him dead. One could imagine the danger of entering Bai Ming at this time. As subordinates, whether it was Tai Hu or Bai Zhuo, if they had a choice, they all hoped that Yang Qindong would give up on this decision. However, they knew that since the sixth young master had spoken to them so formally, he had already made his decision. What they needed to consider now was not dissuasion, but whether they could ensure the safety of the sixth young master. Chapter 770. No one knew what the current state of the Bai Ming imperial court was, and what their attitude towards Yang Qindong was. Tai Hu and Bai Zhui could not influence those people at all. All they could do was try their best to protect the sixth young master's safety. After about 7 or 8 seconds of silence, Tai Hu and Bai Zhui stood up and gave a very standard military salute to Yang Qindong. Sixth young master, we will do our best. Unless we die, we will not let anyone threaten your safety. Good. I understand what you mean. Yang Qindong's smile became wider. This was the result he wanted. As the saying goes, one must always be on guard against people. This time, he went to Bai Ming's capital with no intention to kill anyone. However, if someone wanted to assassinate him, then he would have to take some heads and tell the world that the murderer would be killed. The camp of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment had been built. The soldiers of the 3 new regiments had finished clearing the snow. After eating, they quickly went to rest after a day of hard work. Outside the tent, there were only some soldiers of the 2nd Regiment patrolling with torches. Everything looked so tranquil and peaceful. However, a very dangerous aura was sweeping over from the southwest direction. The Tatar cavalry on Saihan Mountain had finally decided to make a move. Mazum was the leader of the Tatar cavalry on Saihan Mountain. When Tatar was glorious, he became a member of the great Khan Tuachuo Buwa's army. He revealed his ability in constant battles and finally became the commander of tens of thousands of troops. Later, Yeshen and Agador conspired to deal with Tuachuo Buwa. Although they did not succeed in the end, the glorious Tatar army fell from prosperity to decline. Because of this, Mazum led his army back to Saihan Mountain. While accumulating strength, he waited for the great Khan Tuachuo Buwa's summons. However, it seemed that his luck wasn't that good. First, the team he sent to fetch water was robbed by the mercenaries, causing him to be furious. Then, he received news that Agador's 50,000 cavalrymen were defeated. This made him, who originally wanted to teach the first city a lesson, suppress the anger in his heart and wait for another opportunity. He originally thought that even if the opportunity appeared, it would have to wait until spring next year. They never thought that in this season of snow, the mercenaries would suddenly make a move. They actually wanted to attack the city of Nadaru. Moreover, the scouts sent news that the front and middle of the mercenaries had already passed by the side of Saihan Mountain. Now, what appeared in front of them was the rear of the mercenaries. Nadaru City was his ally, and everyone listened to Tuachuo Buwa's orders. However, facing the main army of the mercenaries' main army, Mazum was not confident that he could severely injure them and force them to retreat. He could only watch them pass by him. Until the rear army arrived, he saw hope. Your mercenaries are powerful. They can even defeat the main Tatar army led by Agador. I can't afford to offend them. However, how powerful could your rear army be? especially when the information from the scouts indicated that there were still 6,000 new recruits in this 8,000-strong mercenary army. Mazem was even more certain that his opportunity had arrived. With the same number of troops, the gap between the recruits and the veterans was very big. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that on the battlefield, in a chaotic battle, even 5 rookies might not be a match for 1 veteran. This was because they lacked combat experience and didn't know what to do in order to survive better and better. Therefore, under normal circumstances, no matter how many recruits there were, it was difficult for the veterans to pay attention to them. But now, there were only 2,000 veteran mercenaries and 6,000 new recruits. This gave Mazem hope. He called over his most valued general, Boris, and decided to give him 5,000 cavalrymen to launch a surprise attack on the rear of the mercenaries at the foot of the mountain and cut off their escape route. Not only would he be able to take revenge for the water, but it was also equivalent to giving his ally, Amu Gulong, another form of support. After Bila received the order, he immediately gathered 5,000 cavalry and left the city after eating an early dinner. When the sky was completely dark, he was already less than 10 li away from the rear army of the mercenaries. Damn this weather! Looking up at the sky, Bila found that snowflakes had started to fall again. He couldn't help but curse. If it was summer, he would be able to reach the front of the enemy with a few charges. Then he would charge into the enemy's camp and cut off the enemy's head. But now, in such bad weather, the heavy snow had submerged the hooves of the war horses. How difficult would it be to charge? Pass down the order. Everyone dismount and lead the horses forward. Maintain the strength of the war horses to the greatest extent and slowly advance forward. Helpless, Bila had no choice but to make such a decision. He threw away the war horses that had the most advantage. This was originally a helpless matter, giving up the advantage and engaging in close combat with the enemy. Fortunately, they couldn't ride the war horses, and the mercenaries were the same. The heavens were very fair and gave everyone the same environment. This way, Bila was still very confident. The snow seemed to be getting heavier and heavier. It seemed like the light snow was about to turn into a heavy snow. Bora and his 5,000 cavalrymen were walking on the snowy ground. From time to time, they would hear the sound of soldiers falling into piles of snow, unable to extricate themselves, and calling for help. The army moved slowly. After all, they were on the grasslands and were already used to such bad weather. Therefore, apart from being slower, they were still able to approach the rear army of the mercenaries step by step. After walking for 4 hours, they finally arrived at a place 2 li away from the camp. Due to the heavy snow, the vision of the scouts of the second group was greatly obstructed. Bila's luck wasn't bad. He was able to reach this place without being discovered. However, their luck came to an end. It was impossible for 5,000 cavalrymen to completely fool the enemy. Therefore, their appearance was still discovered by the scouts. Then, a white light suddenly soared into the sky and streaked across the top of Baile's army of 5,000. Flare, the white light instantly illuminated the entire ground and revealed the figures of the 5,000 Tatar cavalry. When the scout saw the number of people on the other side with the help of this flare, the urgent sound of a horn resounded across the land. Enemy attack! Enemy attack! The enemy is cavalry. There are around 4,000 to 6,000 of them. After the scouts estimated the enemy's military strength based on their experience, they began to run as fast as they could, shouting and spreading the news. What is that? How can it be so bright? Could it be that the moon has fallen from the sky? The Tatar army that had been alarmed by the flares began to discuss among themselves. They had never seen or even heard of a flare before. At this moment, many of them were trembling in fear. Bila was also shocked by the flare. However, as the main commander, he knew that now wasn't the time to discuss this. How to stabilize the morale of the army and obtain victory was the most urgent matter. All soldiers listen to my order. Charge with me. The enemy only has 2,000 veterans and 6,000 recruits. We launched a surprise attack. They are no match for us. Bila used an extremely bewitching voice to speak. Then he used his actions as an example and led his horse to charge forward. If Bila could abandon his horse and charge forward with the 5,000 Tatar soldiers, it would be possible for them to launch a surprise attack over a distance of 2 li. They might even be able to obtain victory. However, the grassland warriors trusted their horses too much. They didn't know what kind of consequences such an action would bring. The flare shot into the sky. This scene was clearly seen by the commander of the 2nd Battalion, Ding Shan, who was on night watch. His expression immediately became serious. He said to the soldiers beside him, "It's an enemy attack. Blow the whistle immediately. Everyone gather." Beep, 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 beep. The hurried whistle sounded and spread throughout the entire camp. Out of condition reflex, all the soldiers who were still sleeping when they heard the whistle immediately reacted. They got dressed and got up. They took the weapons piled in their tents and rushed out of the camp to gather their troops. The 6,000 new recruits also rushed out of their tents one by one. However, many of the soldiers were still in a sleepy state. There were even some who showed dissatisfaction. During the day, they worked hard to sweep the snow. At night, they still had to conduct an emergency training. Would they still have the strength to work during the day? The soldiers who had such thoughts were not the only one. They all had dissatisfaction on their faces. However, when they saw the commander of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment, Lu Zhuo, walk in front of their troops, everyone's expression became serious. They were very clear that if they wanted to gain a foothold in the mercenary army, every performance was very important. They couldn't let the commander see their lazy side. "Soldiers, we have encountered an enemy attack. The enemy is less than 2 miles away from us. Now, everyone, please pick up the weapons in your hands and fight together with the soldiers of the 2nd Regiment. Please remember, this is not a training exercise. This is a real battle." After giving a salute, Lu Zhuo gave a few instructions to the new regiment commander. Then, he strode towards another new regiment. Wow! At this moment, the entire new regiment was like a boiling pot. They thought that it would be like the previous training. They didn't expect that everything was real. Were they going to participate in the battle? When they thought of their families and brothers and sisters who had been waiting for them to make military contributions in the beginning city, all the soldiers' eyes lit up. Batu was also in this new regiment. Originally, he was also a part of the people who had complaints in his heart. However, now, he didn't have any complaints. There were only sparkling eyes, and some were eager to give it a try. Chapter 771. Mother, sister, just wait for the good news of my meritorious service. Batu encouraged himself in his heart and made up his mind. Then his right hand gripped his saber even tighter. Very quickly, the recruits of the 3 regiments knew that this was not a drill, but a real battle. The 6,000 soldiers suppressed the excitement in their hearts and turned it into motivation. Each and every one of them widened their eyes and clenched their fists. They couldn't wait for the enemy to appear in front of them and let them kill to their heart's content. Recruit 1st Regiment, come with me to get your bows and arrows. Starting from the 1st Company of the 1st Battalion, come with me. The commander's voice sounded in the silent night. Squads of soldiers followed the voice and followed the shadow to the carriage behind them. They were in charge of escorting the supplies. Not only did they have all the necessities like bows and arrows, but they also had a lot of them. the 3 new regiments began to move. Lu Xue also walked to the side of his 3 battalion commanders. "You guys go and prepare. We have already cleared a piece of the snow nearby, and it's just enough for the cavalry to spread out. In a while, when the enemy is suppressed by the bows and arrows, you guys have to rush out when you hear the call to charge. Remember, the 6,000 recruits are watching you. Don't smear the reputation of our reinforced 2nd Regiment." Hearing Lu Xue's instructions, the 3 battalion commanders said in unison, "Commander, don't worry. Just wait and see our performance." From the moment they received the news of the enemy's attack to the time they prepared for battle, Lu Xue and his 3 battalion commanders didn't show any signs of panic. Everything was just as Yang Chendong had said. They had to maintain a fighting spirit at all times. Only then could they face the battle calmly and without panic. The mercenary camp was ready to face the enemy. Not far away, after a quarter of an hour, Bai Lo finally appeared with his 5,000 cavalrymen. If they had abandoned their horses, they would have saved more than half of the time. This way, the mercenaries wouldn't have time to gather and prepare. Unfortunately, Bai Lo missed the golden opportunity to attack. Now that he appeared, he had already become a live target. The reinforced 2nd Cavalry Regiment didn't have any firearms and couldn't kill enemies from a distance. However, each of them had a strong bow and 50 arrows, which gave them great confidence. Bala finally appeared and saw the mercenary tents in the distance. But what puzzled him was that the surrounding area was obviously pitch black, and there wasn't even a single torch. It gave people the feeling that it was as silent as a dead camp. The scene in front of Bella gave her a bad feeling. However, since she had already rushed here, she had no choice but to release the arrow. He could even feel that there were pairs of eyes staring at him from the darkness, but he still gave the order for the entire army to charge. "Everyone, abandon your horses and charge forward as infantry. It's time to defeat the mercenaries and spread the fame of our Tatar cavalry. Let's kill them together." Holding his saber high in the air and a small wooden round shield in his left hand, Bora gave the order for the army to charge. Kill! Under the command of their commander, the 5,000 Tatar soldiers roared and charged forward like a tide. In the darkness, the black color was like water, giving off a majestic and boundless aura. The mercenary tents were dark and silent. Under Lu Xue's command, all the torches were extinguished. After waiting for a few minutes, everyone's vision returned to normal, and they could clearly see the enemies in the distance. When they saw that there were so many enemies that it was as if there was no end to them, many of the recruits began to break out in cold sweat from their foreheads, bodies, and palms. Although their usual training was based on actual combat, and in the short 2 months of recruit training, they had carried out several military exercises, but exercises were still exercises and couldn't be treated as real. This time, they were facing real enemies. If they weren't careful, they might lose their lives here. People would die in war. Everyone understood this principle. The only difference was who would be the one to die. Calm down, take a deep breath. Think of our family members who are waiting for good news. Think of the beautiful future. Look at the target, adjust your breathing, and prepare to release the arrows. Mixed in with the recruits, there were many veteran squad leaders and vice squad leaders. They felt the changes in the recruits and constantly spoke words of encouragement. Voices sounded one after another, causing the originally nervous and restless recruit camp to become much quieter. At this time, the Tatar soldiers had already rushed to a position 80 meters in front of the camp. They had already entered the range of the bows and arrows. "Release the arrows." A loud shout suddenly sounded. It was the voice of the 1st regiment leader of the recruits. The 2nd Regiment leader and the 3rd Regiment leader of the recruits responded in unison, out of instinct. As soon as the voice fell, countless arrows broke through the air and shot towards the Tatar soldiers. Ding, ding, dang, 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 ding, ding. The sound of arrows breaking through the air, falling to the ground, and colliding with shields and weapons rang out one after another. It was very lively. A wave of 6,000 arrows was shot out and collided with the Tatar soldiers. For a moment, countless black figures fell to the ground. At least 300 people suffered different degrees of arrow injuries. The effect is not bad. Again, release the arrows. Seeing that 6,000 arrows were shot out, but only 300 of them were killed or injured, the new recruit commander couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Recruits were still recruits, after all. They were still too nervous, so much so that most of them didn't perform to their full potential. Voices of encouragement rang out. Compared to before, some of the recruits had already begun to adapt. When they took out their bows from their quivers, their hands were no longer trembling like before. Their gazes had also become much calmer at this moment. Haha, did you see that? Recruits are still recruits. Even this can't hurt us. What are you afraid of? Let's kill together. Bai La was protected by a group of bodyguards. When the arrows came from afar, if it wasn't a shield in front of him, then it was a meat shield. After a wave of arrows, not only was he not injured, but even the bodyguards protecting him were not injured. This result naturally made him overjoyed. In an instant, his self-confidence exploded. He shouted loudly to encourage the soldiers below. At the same time, he increased the pace and speed of the charge. It was true that the opponents were recruits, and most of them hadn't gone to the battlefield. However, don't forget that they had trained in the mercenary camp for 2 months. Originally, they were selected from more than 10,000 young adults. Originally, they had a good foundation. In addition to the hard training, their strength had undergone a qualitative change in a very short period of time. The first wave of arrows didn't perform well because it was the first time, and they were too nervous. However, when they let go of their nervousness and picked up their bows, many of the soldiers had already entered a state of mind. They had one eye open and the other closed as they aimed at the target. After adjusting their breathing, the arrows were released and flew out like meteors. Once they entered a state of mind, the advantage of the arrows began to show. Even if only 1/6 of the 6,000 soldiers hit the target, the result was still very frightening. When the arrows fell into the Tatar army, the result was that more and more soldiers were hit by the arrows and fell on the path of the charge. Good shot. Seeing the enemy falling to the ground one by one, and only less than 6 out of 10 were able to reach the front, the commander Lu Zhuo laughed loudly. Come, blow the horn of charge. It's time for us to counterattack. Toot, 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 toot. The loud and clear horn of charge had been blown. Along with this exciting sound, thousands of war horses suddenly rushed out from the left and right sides of the battlefield. The war horses galloped at high speed in the heavy snow, bringing up white snowflakes one after another. Correspondingly, there was dark red blood mixed with the white snow. The snow around the camp had already been cleared. The heavy snow had just covered the ground, and it couldn't stop the war horses from galloping wildly in this area. Under the high-speed charge of the war horses, when the sabers fell from the sky, countless heads flew up from the ground, and countless blood splattered across the ground. The accuracy of the arrows had increased, and there was also the fierce attack of the war horses. At this moment, the Tatar army had a feeling of being beaten silly. How did the arrows that were just for show become so accurate? Why did the frequency of the arrows become faster and faster? Why could the enemy cavalry gallop freely on the ground covered in heavy snow? Why, There were too many whys, but no one would answer them now. There were only the screams and cries of their companions for help. General, let's retreat. We have already lost 40% of our combat strength. If we don't retreat now, I'm afraid we won't be able to retreat. Seeing more and more of his companions being killed on the ground and the number of soldiers around him decreasing, a Chiliarch ran to Bai La's side and complained tearfully. Bai La still had a trace of unwillingness. He hadn't really fought with the enemy's recruits yet. He believed that if they could engage in close combat, their advantage would be obvious. This was also the main reason why he dared to bring 5,000 soldiers to fight against the 8,000 mercenaries. However, the situation on the battlefield didn't allow him to do so, because if the battle continued, he was afraid that it would be like what the Chiliarch said. He would have no chance of escaping at that time. Even if he severely injured the mercenaries, what could he do? Clenching his teeth, his face was filled with unwillingness. After changing his mind several times, Bai La finally gritted his teeth and gave the order, "Retreat, retreat as you fight. If the enemy dares to charge over, counterattack with all your strength when the snow is thick." Chapter 772. The Tatar army retreated. They came like the tide and left like the ebbing tide. Seeing this, the 6,000 recruits cheered in excitement. Then someone shouted, "Kill!" Then the 6,000 soldiers chased after the retreating Tatar army. Due to the terrain, the 2,000 veterans of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment had limited space to move around. When they chased the enemy into deep snow, the only thing they could do was to watch the enemy escape. At the very least, they could only fire a few more arrows. However, the new soldiers who relied on their legs didn't care about this. They charged through the thick snow and rushed in front of the Tatar soldiers running behind them. They brandished their swords and hacked at them. The number of soldiers in the new regiment was too many. Perhaps they didn't have much experience in fighting, or perhaps it was their first time seeing blood. However, when 4 or 5 or even more recruits simultaneously attacked a veteran, even if the veteran's strength wasn't bad, 2 fists were no match for 4 palms. In the end, after leaving behind nearly 100 corpses, they fled in a sorry state. Withdraw the troops and return to camp. Following the military strategy of not chasing a cornered enemy, Lu Zhuo promptly ordered the overly excited recruits to stop. The snow in front of them was too thick. If they fought there, no one would be able to gain an advantage, and he wouldn't do a losing trade. The commander gave the order. Following orders was always the first lesson for the recruits. No matter how dissatisfied they were, they could only obediently retreat. Then they counted the spoils of war and the number of enemies killed. Originally, Bai La was prepared to counterattack halfway. Seeing that his last chance was gone, he sighed and led the army back to Saihan Mountain. He had already lost 2,000 soldiers and horses. Now, he no longer had any advantage in terms of military strength. If he continued to fight, he would only be looking for trouble. In the end, it wasn't that Bai La didn't have a chance to win. If he could have abandoned his horse at the earliest moment and suddenly attacked, the 3 new regiments wouldn't have enough time to assemble. Under the chaos, they wouldn't be able to form an effective resistance. Only the heavens knew what the result would be. The failure of command made Bai La return in failure. He didn't seize the fleeting opportunity. Lu Zhuo ordered people to clean up the battlefield and count the results. At the same time, he ordered people to quickly report the results to the 6th young master at the front. In the warm tent, Yang Chendong, who was sitting beside the stove, already knew the news of the Tatar army on Saihan Mountain. However, he didn't care much. He was still very confident in Lu Zhuo's 2nd Cavalry Regiment. As for the 3 new regiments, they might suffer some losses in this battle, but how could this not be a training exercise? It was not a bad thing to let them feel the true atmosphere of war, and to let them know the cruelty of war. When Beta Persei hurriedly entered the tent and reported the results of Lu Zhu's 2nd Cavalry Regiment, and explained that the Tatar army had retreated, Yang Qindong's face didn't show the slightest shock. It was as if all of this was expected and normal. In contrast, Beta Persei's reaction was not as calm as Yang Qindong's. Seeing that he didn't speak, Beta Persei said, "Young master, this Tatar army on Saihan Mountain is really wretched. We haven't even gone to find trouble with them, but they have already set their sights on us. Young master, please grant me permission. I'm willing to make a trip to the 2nd Regiment. Together with Regiment Commander Lu Zhu, we'll kill our way up Saihan Mountain and pull out this malignant tumor beside us." Yang was a little angry. Of course, he also wanted to make a contribution. Although he was a servant of the Yang family and should be by Yang Qindong's side, he didn't want to miss the opportunity to perform well on the battlefield. No need. Yang Qindong shook his head and said indifferently, "They won't be able to do anything. Let them stay there for now. When the time is right, we will naturally clean up these bugs." It was freezing cold outside, and it was snowing heavily. It would be extremely difficult to rush up Saihan Mountain at this moment. There was no need to spend so much effort to deal with an enemy that couldn't threaten their safety at all. In the end, Saihan Mountain was not the target of this military attack. Taking down Tulu City and opening up the passage from the first city to Ming was the first thing to do. With Yang Qindong's personality, once he set a goal, he would definitely achieve it. Everything else had to give way to him. Since Yang Qindong said that there was no need, Beta Persei knew that it was meaningless to fight for it. He nodded and said, "Young master, Tiger Man sent a message saying that they are ready to attack the city tomorrow. Do you have any other orders?" "Just follow the plan. I don't have any special orders." Yang Qindong shook his head again. Before leaving, he had talked to Tiger Man about what to do. This person had been with him for a long time and knew best in his heart what to do. Tiger Man really knew what Yang Qindong was thinking. If it weren't for the special geographical location of Tulu City, with just the 10,000 Tatar army, they wouldn't be able to withstand the pressure of the army. What Yang Qindong wanted was a safe passage. That being the case, Tulu City must be taken down. Not only that, but the damage must not be too serious. Otherwise, how could a ruined city house the army and the people? In this world of ice and snow, even if they wanted to rebuild the city, the conditions were not enough. So after setting up the camp, Tiger Man called Su He and the other generals to express his intentions. "Tomorrow, when we attack the city, we will try to deal with the enemy outside the city. Even if we kill our way into the city, as long as they are not rebels, don't kill them easily. We have to try our best to maintain the good nature of Tulu City. What we need is a city where people can live and garrison. This is the 6th young master's intention. Does everyone understand?" When they heard that it was Yang Qindong's intention, the expressions of the officers, who had not taken it seriously, immediately became serious. They all nodded, indicating that they would abide by the military order and try their best not to destroy the city and not to kill indiscriminately in the city. In the camp, the 10,000 mercenaries had a good night's rest. When the sun rose the next morning, smoke rose in spirals. From afar, it looked like fog, like a paradise on earth. On the walls of Tulu City, Amu Gulong looked at all this and sighed. What will come will come. Since that's the case, let me go out of the city and see how powerful they are. General, be careful. Deputy General Shibi wanted to persuade him to defend the city with him, but when he thought about how cavalry could only be effective on the open ground, he suppressed the words in his heart. Haha, it's fine. People will die eventually. For a general, Dying on the battlefield is a blessing, isn't it? Laughing, Amu Gulong put on the armor that his personal guards had given him, mounted his war horse, and led his 5,000 men out of the city. Below Tulu, both sides had already gotten into formation. From a distance, they looked neat and orderly, their war horses standing straight. They were like two colossi standing in the middle of the world. The snow had stopped falling in the early morning. For this battle, both sides had sent out soldiers to clean up the ground to ensure that the cavalry could exert their greatest advantage. The cleared ground in the middle of the battlefield was undoubtedly going to be the final battleground for both sides. Tiger's man, Su He, and the others were also mounted on their horses. They looked at the 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen opposite them, and an aura of death seemed to wash over them. This Amu Gulong is also an expert in commanding an army. It's a pity that such a person would become an enemy. Tiger's man looked at all this and said with emotion. Suhi understood Tiger's man's meaning and also saw that he wanted to accept this good general. Because of this, he shook his head and said, "It's useless, Tiger's man. This Amu Gulong is deeply indebted to the great Khan of Tuachuobuhua. He will never surrender. Yes, if he doesn't surrender, then he can only die." Tiger's man also knew that in the face of Suhi's persuasion, the other side had no intention of talking at all. This was enough to explain everything. If that was the case, then they would just fight. If they couldn't be friends, then they could only be enemies. At this time, Amu Gulong was also sweeping his eyes over the mercenaries opposite him. When he saw that the other side's army was also neat and orderly, and when he looked at them from afar, a wave of austere aura rushed over. He couldn't help but sigh. Mercenaries were indeed mercenaries. Just from the formation alone, many grassland cavalrymen could only achieve this much. Humph, good formation and strong aura doesn't mean that you have powerful battle strength. Come, everyone get ready. Today we will break the myth of the invincible war god. Everyone listen to my orders. Follow this general. Charge. Amu Gulong was still holding a 2-meter-long sword in his hand. With a loud shout, he waved his sword forward. The war horse under him seemed to understand his words, and was the first to leave the group and charge forward. The Tatar cavalrymen moved like thunder. Under the city walls of Tulu, they formed a fan and charged towards the mercenaries. As if they knew that the mercenaries had firearms, the 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen were not too concentrated. Instead, they were very scattered. Each cavalryman maintained a distance of at least 3 meters from each other as they charged straight for the kill. The earth trembled as if it was shaking. It was like a tsunami, making it impossible for people to regain their previous calmness. Seeing the enemy cavalrymen charging over with great morale, Tiger's man raised his right hand unhurriedly and loudly ordered, "Independent Regiment, 6 firearm battalions, listen to my orders. Wait until the enemy is 600 meters away before firing. Before that, no one is allowed to move without orders. Otherwise, you will be punished by military law." They had already decided on how to deal with these 5,000 Tatar cavalrymen during last night's meeting. That was to use firearms to heavily injure the enemy. Chapter 773. Although it wasn't difficult for the Independent Regiment and the Tatar Cavalry Regiment to deal with 5,000 Tatar cavalry, Tiger's man still made the decision to use firearms to defeat the enemy. He quoted Yang Qindong's words, "Since we can pay a smaller price, there is no need to make the soldiers suffer." Su He and Xian Honghai naturally agreed with this decision. However, they weren't without worries. For example, the effective range of the Type 81 rifle was around 800 meters, and the best shooting range was between 200 to 600 meters. If the enemy was allowed to reach this distance, Wouldn't the army fall into chaos? After all, if one side's morale was high and the other side didn't move, it would be a test of the people's will. If things went wrong, the army's morale might collapse. If that happened, the enemy would take advantage of the situation and kill them. The result would be unimaginable. Tiger's man only smiled at this concern. You must have confidence in our soldiers. Speaking of which, isn't this a test? If they can't even withstand this little test, then they don't deserve to be a part of the mercenary army. They can't be called elites. Tiger's man made the final decision under his insistence. Now that the enemy was getting closer and closer, whether it was Su, he, or Xi and Honghai, they all showed a trace of worry on their faces. They even observed the reactions and emotions of the surrounding soldiers more than once, afraid that some of them would be frightened by the aura and turn around to escape. The enemy was charging with full force and killing intent, but they had to stay in place and wait. This was indeed a test, especially when the enemy was getting closer and closer. The neighing of the war horses became clearer and clearer. Many of the warriors who were waiting on the spot revealed anxious expressions. Some of the war horses even began to snort uneasily, lightly lifting their hooves and pacing around on the spot. Perhaps these war horses were reminding their masters that it was time for them to charge as well. Anxiety could be seen on everyone's face. Some of the soldiers who weren't mentally strong turned pale, but fortunately, there weren't any deserters. Even though the cavalry on the other side was getting closer and closer, and the pressure was getting stronger and stronger, most of them were still staring ahead. Without any orders, they didn't even draw their cavalry swords. Tiger's mane was also paying attention to the reaction of the army. He couldn't help but smile when he saw that the soldiers' expressions had changed, but their formation was still stable. It was said that the battlefield was the best place to test and train a warrior. It seemed that this was indeed the case. Of course, Hu Meng still had a sense of propriety when doing things. He knew that going too far was bad. Seeing that the pressure on the soldiers had reached a peak, he finally gave the order. Everyone listen up. Draw your swords. As soon as he shouted, the trumpeter beside him immediately blew a very short bugle call. This was one of the characteristics of mercenaries. Most of the time, they would use loud bugles to replace the traditional signal flags. Compared to the command flag, which they had to stare at closely, the sound of the bugle could be heard more clearly, allowing them to make the correct judgment and action immediately. Schwa! The sound of swords being drawn rang out in unison. Thousands of cavalry did the same action in unison, giving off a very imposing feeling. Just this one action instantly lifted the spirits of the soldiers, who were originally in low spirits. At this moment, the Tatar cavalry on the other side was already 800 meters away, and they were still charging forward. AMU Gulang, who was charging in the middle of the troops, was flushed red with excitement. He originally thought that he would definitely lose this battle because he didn't have enough troops. In fact, he came this time with the mentality of facing death with equanimity. The only difference was that he wanted to see how many enemies he could kill in the end. However, he never thought that the mercenaries would be so careless and allow him to bring his troops closer. Could it be that the commander of the enemy didn't know that in order for the cavalry to display their strength, they had to constantly charge and increase their speed, relying on the advantage of speed to increase the power of their swords? AMU Gulang cursed the idiocy of the enemy commander in his heart. He became more and more excited as he saw the hope of victory. He believed that as long as he charged forward once he entered the camp of the mercenaries, even if the enemy had guns, they wouldn't be able to do anything to him. Perhaps he would really become the first grassland army to defeat the mercenaries. AMU Gulang was very happy, and the cavalry following him were also very excited. They urged their horses to charge forward with all their might, increasing their speed to the maximum. They wanted to charge into the camp of the unprepared mercenaries and then inflict heavy damage to them to obtain the final victory. Their speed was increased to the maximum, and the distance of 200 meters was covered in a flash. When the distance between the two sides reached 600 meters, Tiger's man's eyes narrowed, and he loudly gave the order to open fire. The sound of the bugle call to open fire broke the silence of the battlefield once again. The 6 battalions of independent soldiers holding the Type 81 rifles rode on their horses, holding their guns. They had already adjusted their breathing and even aimed at the enemy. Their right index finger moved, and the scene of 10,000 guns being fired at the same time appeared. Bang, 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 bang. The sound of gunfire was loud, and the golden bullets flew toward the Tatar cavalry. Both sides collided on their respective paths, causing flowers to bloom and blood to splatter. When the bullets entered the human body, under the powerful force, some of the bullets directly sank into the human body, causing damage to the tissues. Some of the bullets simply rushed out and entered the body of the second cavalryman behind, causing continuous damage. The sudden sound of gunfire had already made AMU Gulong cry out in his heart. However, he didn't know much about the new continuous fire guns, so he thought that the mercenaries opposite him were like the great Ming dynasty's Divine Arms Battalion, and that their guns could only shoot up to 100 meters away. The reason why the enemy opened fire now was just to create a kind of momentum and put a huge psychological pressure on his soldiers. It was precisely because he didn't think much of it that when he heard the gunfire, AMU Gulong immediately shouted to the cavalrymen beside him, "Everyone, don't panic. Their guns can't shoot that far. They are just trying to scare." Ugh. Before he could finish his sentence, or rather, he was only halfway through when the scene in front of him shocked him. He realized that many of his soldiers had fallen off their horses at this moment. Although some of them didn't fall off their horses, their bodies were already covered in blood, and more blood was flowing out. In the end, they lay on their horses, fainting from excessive blood loss or dying from blood loss. Open fire! Tiger's man was relieved when he saw that the first wave of enemies from afar had suffered countless casualties. At this time, if he led the army to counterattack, victory was already in his grasp. However, since he still had cannons in his hands, he naturally had to make good use of them. The 6th young master had said that wasting resources was an extremely shameful thing. A new military order was issued, and the loud bugles sounded again. The 2 100mm sniper cannons at the rear that could shoot thousands of meters away were immediately loaded with shells. 2 seconds later, they flew out of the barrels and landed at the coordinates that had been adjusted long ago. Boom, boom. 2 deafening sounds that could even shatter one's eardrums rang out and landed in the central area of the Tatar cavalrymen. Caught off guard, the cavalrymen in that area were blown off their horses, and they were dizzy from the bombardment, especially at the place where the shells landed. A few unlucky cavalrymen didn't even have a corpse left. It was as if they had suddenly disappeared from the world. If the gunshots were just an appetizer that greatly hindered the Tatar cavalrymen's forward momentum, then the sudden appearance of the artillery was like a hammer that heavily smashed people's hearts, causing an unprecedented panic. Blow the bugle call. Charge! Seeing that the enemy's formation was in chaos, and many cavalrymen were even circling around in place, not knowing where was safe, Tiger's man knew that the opportunity to launch the attack had come. Immediately, he shouted loudly. When the loud bugle call resounded in front of the vast land, countless mercenary cavalrymen began to charge forward. They shouted loudly and released the unhappiness in their hearts just now. They waved their sabers and directly rushed towards the Tatar cavalrymen's formation that was already in chaos. At the rear of the Tatar cavalrymen, the 2 cannons extended in the direction of attack, and the 2 shells landed here, making the cavalrymen who were walking at the back feel the threat. The 2 cannons caused at least 100 casualties. The Tatar cavalrymen had never seen such powerful weapons before, so they scattered and fled. They didn't dare to gather together and slowly advance like before. The rear army was in chaos, and the middle army was also in chaos. This bad sign started to spread to the entire battlefield. Without the support of the middle army and the rear army, Amu Gulang, who was in the front army, seemed to have become a lone army. Looking at the less than 500 cavalrymen around him and the countless mercenary cavalrymen rushing toward him, he was like a fugitive who had walked into a dead end. There was no door to heaven. "General, what should we do?" Seeing that the middle of the army and the front of the army had already lost contact, a guard beside Amu Gulang anxiously asked. At this moment, Amu Gulang's face revealed a firm expression. He gritted his teeth and made the final decision of his life. Kill with me, fight with them. At this time, Amu Gulang made the decision to repay the kindness with his life. Based on the care that the great Khan had given him in the past, he couldn't choose to surrender to the mercenaries like the others. Since that was the case, he could only fight with his life on the line. Chapter 774. Kill. After making his decision, Amu Gulang was the first to whip his horse and charge towards the countless mercenaries. Beside him, the 500 Tatar cavalrymen seemed to have been influenced by him and charged forward with a loud roar. "General Suhi, I'll leave this place to your Tatar cavalry. Soldiers of the independent regiment, follow me and charge from both sides." Tiger's Mane saw through Amu Gulang's intentions with a single glance. Since the other party wanted to die for a righteous cause, then he would fulfill his wish. How could Tiger's Mane pay too much attention to an enemy general who wouldn't surrender? After shouting at Suhi, he and Vice Commander Xian Honghai led their troops from the left and right, leaping over Amu Gulang's 500 cavalrymen and charging forward. Amu Gulang also didn't have any thoughts of stopping Tiger's Mane. He had already seen Suhi coming from the front and knew that this was his opponent. He immediately brandished his long sword and charged forward. Both sides didn't have any intention of retreating. Like 2 high-speed mad bulls, they collided with each other in the next moment. Then the cavalrymen intertwined with each other, and the sound of weapons clashing could be heard. Clanking sounds could be heard as the cavalrymen fell from their horses one after another and died on the battlefield. After a charge, when both sides turned their horses around, they saw the corpses of more than 200 cavalrymen on the battlefield. 90% of these corpses belonged to Amu Gulang's men. 500 against 3,000. There was a great disparity in military strength. In addition, the sabers in the hands of the Tatar cavalry were very sharp. Once Amu Gulang's men clashed with them, the sabers would often break after 5 or 6 strikes. At that time, they would only be at the mercy of the enemy. In just one clash, they had lost more than 200 soldiers. Nearly half of their forces had been lost. A ghast could be seen in Amu Gulang's eyes. But then his face turned red, and he shouted again, "Follow me and kill." The second clash began. Sabers were waved, shouting, and war horses neighed. There were 3,000 people on one side and 200 on the other. Once again, they clashed. Amu Gulang brandished his 3-meter-long blade, continuously slashing about. He had exchanged blows with at least 7 mercenaries, killing 2 of them on their horses. However, he was also tired to the point where he was gasping for breath. When he turned around to look at his horse again, he saw another 200 or so corpses on the battlefield. Most of them were still his subordinates. "General, I'm afraid we can't hold on any longer." It was still the same bodyguard. He seemed to be quite lucky to have held on until now. However, the others were not so lucky. There were originally 500 cavalrymen, but now there were only about 50 left. Not only that, but most of them were also injured. Even without the soldiers' reminder, AMU Gulong could see that the situation was very unfavorable. However, for AMU Gulong, who had long been prepared to die, this was just a matter of asking for mercy. How many of them did we kill? You've seen it clearly. Although he knew that he was about to die, Agu Gulong was still concerned about the number of enemies he had killed. Perhaps this was the reason why he insisted on fighting to the death. Even if he died, he would drag some of them down with him. This may be less than 30 people. The soldier's eyesight was not bad, but because of this, he saw a little too clearly and said some hurtful words. Less than 30 people? Hearing this answer, AMU Gulong's face flashed with a very awkward expression. Of course, this was because his military strength was not as good as the enemy's. However, more than 400 people died, and less than 30 of the enemy's men were killed. This result was still unacceptable to him. He was very sad. Could it be that this was the price he had to pay in exchange for his blood? Were the mercenaries really so powerful? AMU Gulong could be considered a general. At least his will to fight to the death was not something that some people could compare to. The Tatar cavalry he led could also be considered to be good at fighting. However, when faced with the valiant mercenaries, they were at an absolute disadvantage in terms of numbers and weapons. The outcome of this battle was already set in stone. Suhi originally had the talent of a general. Otherwise, Yang Chendong would not have spent so much effort to recruit him. In addition, the Tatar cavalry he led were the most elite forces in Agu Dorji's hands. Recently, they were equipped with the new sabers. It could be said that they were like a tiger that had grown wings. Moreover, during this period of time, they ate well, and the intensity of their training was several times stronger than before. Their strength was also many times stronger than before. Under such conditions, how could they be defeated? Even if nearly 30 people were killed or injured, this was because AMU Gulong and his soldiers were good at martial arts. Otherwise, the price of nearly 30 people would not have been paid. AMU Gulong's heart was sad, but he did not have time to think too much. On the opposite side, Suhi had once again led the army to kill them. As if he knew that AMU Gulong was not willing to die, he did not even have the intention to persuade him. Kill! Although there were only 50 brothers left, AMU Gulong still did not have the intention to retreat. After a loud shout, he once again waved the 3-meter-long saber and rushed forward. This time, his target was Suhi. Generals against generals, this was a kind of challenge, but also a kind of determination. It showed that AMU Gulong had given up on the road of survival and was determined to severely injure Suhi before he died. After all, Suhi was Agu Dorji's most trusted general. His status was far higher than AMU Gulong's. Even in terms of personal strength, Suhi was much stronger than AMU Dorji. He knew that the opponent was stronger, but he still wanted to challenge. This kind of courage had already explained everything. Leave this person to me. You guys go and deal with the others. Suhi also saw AMU Gulong's determination to fight to the death. He immediately decided to help him. He glanced at Gushan and the others who were protecting him. Gushan and the others had to obey the general's order. After a sound of agreement, they rushed to the other enemies. For a time, the battlefield became a vacuum. Suhi stood with his saber, waiting for AMU Gulong to approach. In the distance, a man and a horse were approaching quickly. The 3-meter-long broadsword had already been raised. When they were 3 meters away from Suhi, the broadsword fell from the air and pressed down with the whistling sound of the wind. Clenching the saber in his right hand, Suhi stared at Amu Galong's every move. When the saber fell, he moved sideways and raised his saber to cut it. Under the powerful arm, the collision of the two weapons caused a spark. Under the huge force, the saber was indeed crooked. Under the collision of the saber, it almost fell out of his hand. Forcibly holding the 3-meter-long saber, Amu Galong's face showed a shocked expression. He had long heard that he was an all-rounder. Before, he didn't take it seriously. It wasn't until he really fought with him that he realized that a famous general was indeed a famous general. Sure enough, he wasn't so easy to deal with. The saber fell and also narrowed the distance between the two sides. At this moment, the advantage of the saber was revealed. As the saying goes, an inch shorter is an inch more dangerous. At close range, the horse chopping blade that was only a meter long was able to fully display its agility. Under the incessant chopping from top to bottom, it caused Amu Galangdi's mind to be thrown into disarray. Numerous wounds appeared on his body. If it was someone else who was cut by the sharp saber, they would have fallen off the horse and been defeated. But Amu Galong was determined to die. He was completely relying on his spirit to make a final resistance. He had already ignored the wounds on his body. He thought that if he could kill Suhi, even if he died, it would be worth it. In Suhi's eyes, Amu Galong's unwillingness to fight to the death made him reveal a look of admiration. But this was a battlefield, not making friends. Although he was shocked by the opponent's determination to fight to the death, Suhi's hands didn't stop. Not only did he wave the saber forward, he also found an opportunity to grab the back of the saber and held it in his hand. If it was under normal circumstances, if Suhi dared to be so arrogant, Amu Galong only needed to use all his strength to regain control of the weapon. It was not impossible for him to take the opportunity to seriously injure Suhi, but now he was already covered in scars. His strength was almost exhausted. Facing Suhi's huge strength, he was already powerless to resist. With his saber restrained, Amu Galong could only passively take the beating. After instinctively dodging two sabers, the saber fell on his chest for the third time, penetrating his chest. While blood flowed out, the vitality in Amu Galong's eyes quickly disappeared. With a saber in his chest, Amu Galong's strength was also exhausted at this moment. He glanced at who was riding on the horse next to him. He wanted to say something, but his mouth couldn't make any sound except for blood foam. With a plop, Suhi's left hand loosened the saber, and Amu Galong fell from the horse. Even if he died in battle at that moment, he still opened his eyes wide and looked at the sky. It seemed that he still wanted to say, "Great Khan, I didn't let you down. I fought until the last drop of blood." Amu Galong died in battle. The last 50 cavalrymen left by his side also died under the siege of Gushan and the others. But it was worth mentioning that no matter how Gushan tempted them with words, none of the 50 men surrendered. In the end, they fought until the last drop of blood was shed and died. The attack of the independent regiment, led by Tiger's Man, was also very smooth. First, they launched a surprise attack with the muskets, which destroyed the enemy's morale and killed nearly 1,000 cavalrymen. Then, the mortars showed their prowess. The chaotic bombardment disrupted the enemy's formation and dealt them a heavy psychological blow. When the independent regiment came, it was like the last straw that broke the camel's back. The Tatar cavalrymen, whose morale had fallen to the bottom, became a turtle in a jar, a fish in a net. Those who surrender can live, those who resist will be killed. Tiger's Man shouted, and the soldiers of the independent regiment also shouted. During this period, as long as there was resistance, they would swarm up together. Several sabers would come at the same time. No Tatar cavalryman could withstand such power. There was no other choice but to die. Chapter 775. I surrender. Seeing that the general situation was about to change, not even knowing whether the main general Amu Gulang was alive or dead, facing the impressive momentum of the independent regiment, the Tatar cavalry finally threw down the weapons in their hands, jumped off their war horses, and knelt on the ground. Under the pressure, more and more people chose to surrender. They weren't like Amu Gulang, who had received favors from the Great Khan. They joined the army just to make a living. Besides, didn't they see that there were also Tatar cavalry among the mercenaries? Didn't they also surrender? Since there was a precedent when it came to surrendering, no one seemed to be so resistant. Of the 5,000 Tatar cavalry, 2,000 were killed and 3,000 surrendered. Tiger's man, Suhi's troops, only lost less than 150 people, not even a tenth of the enemy's. This was definitely a great victory. Come, take the captives away. Watch them carefully, but don't abuse them. Everyone else, push the cannons up and prepare to attack the city. After dealing with the 5,000 enemy cavalry, Tiger's man's gaze fell on the city of Tulu. He had given the young master a military order yesterday, saying that he would definitely take down the city today. He couldn't go back on his word. For others, it was undoubtedly difficult to take down a city in one day, or even impossible. However, for Tiger's man who had cannons and muskets, this was nothing. Below the city walls of Tulu, Shibi saw everything that happened below. Especially when he saw Amu Gulang die on the battlefield, his eyes quickly became moist. Speaking of which, Shibi was a chess piece that the Great Khan had placed beside Amu Gulang to monitor him. In other words, from a certain point of view, they weren't trusted. It was just that he could see that Amu Gulang didn't want to believe it. In the end, it was the so-called art of balance, which was why the relationship between the two wasn't very good. But no matter what, they had worked together for a while. Seeing Amu Gulang die in front of him, he more or less felt sad. General Amu Gulang, with your death, my mission is complete. Next, I will do my best to defend the city, but he didn't continue because he had already made up his mind. But he still wanted to see the true strength of the mercenaries. He looked at the Tatar soldiers on the city walls and shouted, "Everyone, prepare your bows and arrows. Once the enemy gets close to the city, shoot them back." Using bows and arrows to defend a city was the most commonly used method of defending a city. If it was summer, they would also get some kerosene and catapults, which would greatly increase their defensive capabilities. The archery ability of the Tatar soldiers was still very strong. At the very least, their accuracy was much higher than the Ming Dynasty army. This was related to the environment they grew up in. Horses and bows were always indispensable. However, when facing mercenaries with firearms, everything was a different story. Send someone to tell them to open the city and surrender. Then we won't hurt the soldiers and civilians in the city. Otherwise, don't blame us for being rude. Tiger's mane looked at the Tatar soldiers on the city walls with a pair of binoculars and said with a snort of contempt, "I'll do it." Vice Commander Xian Honghai took the initiative to accept the task. He took a self-made iron horn and rode out alone. When he was 150 meters away from the city walls, he suddenly stopped, and then his loud voice had a chance to show off. "Soldiers on the city walls, listen up," as Xian Honghai shouted. The expressions of the Tatar soldiers on the city walls changed again and again. At this time, many of them couldn't help but look at General Shibi. Obviously, they all knew that if General Amu Gulang's 5,000 cavalrymen were defeated, their 5,000 infantrymen without war horses would not be able to resist at all. If they continued to fight, they would die. If they surrendered, they might find a way to survive. How could Shibi not see the thoughts of the soldiers on the city walls. But if he didn't even fight, he would be letting down the dead AMU Gulam. So he said loudly, "Brothers, I know what you're thinking. But after all, this is a siege, not a cavalry charge. I think we still have the strength to defend the city. If we can't win, it's not too late to surrender. I think you all still like the feeling of freedom." Shibi's understanding of the people's hearts was immediately met with a wave of support from the soldiers. At this moment, the Tatar soldiers standing on the battlements stared at the mercenaries on the city walls. It was as if they were saying, "If you want to come, we'll serve you with bows and arrows." Xian Honghai shouted a few times, but didn't hear any response. He patted his horse and returned to Tiger's Mane's side. He spread out his hands and said, "Tiger's Mane, they won't surrender." "Ha! If they don't surrender, then we'll make them surrender. Men, prepare the cannons. Musketeers, go forward and fire 200 meters away. The rest of the cavalry, get ready to charge with me." Tiger's Mane said with a face full of confidence. With his muskets and cannons, he really didn't put Tulu City in his eyes. The city walls were quickly prepared. 6 battalions, totaling more than 2,000 gunmen, slowly advanced. They stopped 200 meters away from Tulu City. Then they lined up in a straight line and aimed at the city wall. On the city gate tower, between the battlements, Shibi was leading thousands of Tatar soldiers to look down. Originally, they had prepared their bows and arrows to give the enemy a head-on blow. But when they saw the enemy stop 200 meters away, they all looked down curiously. They didn't know what the mercenaries were going to do next. They couldn't be blamed. Their understanding of muskets was completely based on the impression the Ming dynasty gave them. At that time, muskets could only fire up to a distance of 100 meters. It wasn't much different from bows and arrows. The only difference was that it seemed to be more lethal. During the battle with the Ming dynasty, because of the distance, they couldn't see clearly how AMU Gelong's cavalry was hit. The Tatar soldiers still had a confused expression. The 6 battalions of mercenaries didn't hold back. Most of them were auxiliary soldiers. Some of them even had the qualifications to take the cold front test. During this period of training, their strength had reached a new level. Now that they were facing an enemy close by, they were already full of fighting spirit. All they lacked was the order to open fire. Now, the order was finally given. Tiger's Mane raised his right arm and lowered it. The trumpeter beside him blew the bugle horn for permission to open fire. Immediately, the sound of gunfire rang out. Countless bullets flew towards the Tatar soldiers on Tulu City as if they had eyes. The Tatar soldiers, who didn't have the slightest bit of mental preparation and didn't take the musketeers seriously, suffered a great loss. A second after the sound of gunfire rang out, a bloody scene appeared on the city tower. At least a few hundred soldiers were shot in the vitals because they didn't take any precautions. Only a few lucky ones managed to escape with their lives because the bullets missed and hit the battlements. "Quick, squat down. Don't stick your heads out." The moment the gunfire rang out, Bear instinctively lowered his head and leaned against the battlements. Because of this, he managed to avoid a disaster. But when he saw that many soldiers were hit by the muskets because they didn't dodge and fell to the ground with their heads tilted to the side, he couldn't help but shout out loud. Facts speak louder than words. There was no need for Bear to shout. All the soldiers looked for a place to hide with a frightened expression. They were very surprised. What kind of musket was this? Not only could it hit so far, but it was also so accurate. In the face of such a weapon, who would dare to stick their head out and shoot? What was the difference between that and seeking death? Like the other soldiers, Bear's face also showed a frightened expression. He was a general, but he also only had one life. If he was hit by a bullet, he wouldn't be any better. All the Tatar soldiers found a safe place to hide, so they couldn't pose a threat to the mercenaries below the city. It was at this moment that the city tower seemed to tremble. The mortars had begun to show their might. After accurately aiming at the target, the two mortars fired simultaneously. One of the mortars hit the city gate of Talu City. After a loud bang, the seemingly heavy city gate was completely blown apart. Along with the city gate were dozens of Tatar soldiers who were holding huge logs against the city gate. Their task was to guard the city gate. The enemy was cavalry, so they shouldn't be good at sieges. With one side defending and one side attacking, the situation should be in their favor. They didn't expect that the mercenaries wouldn't be polite at all. With just a blast from the two cannons, the city gate was blown apart. They didn't even have the slightest intention of drawing out the distance. When the city gate was opened, the vice commander Xian Honghai on horseback roared and took the lead to charge into Tulu City. Behind him were 5 battalions of 2,000 independent soldiers. Xian Honghai launched an all-out charge. The commander of the Tatar cavalry regiment, Su He, also didn't want to be outdone. With a shout, he also led his troops to follow. While charging, he suppressed the shock in his heart. Heavens! The power of the mercenaries' cannons was too great. With such heavy weapons, what kind of city couldn't they take down? What kind of enemy could stop them? The general on the city tower was even more shocked. From the tremor, he could feel that the mercenaries should have opened the city gate. Now that he heard the sound of iron hooves, he was afraid that they were now rushing into the city. Once they entered the city, with the advantage of cavalry over infantry, how could he resist? At this moment, he suddenly felt powerless. He knew that Tulu City had changed hands. Chapter 776. General, the cavalry used the cannons to blast open the city gates. They are now charging into the city. Our soldiers can't stop them at all. A chilly arch frantically crawled over to Shibi, who was still hiding behind a battlement, and spoke with an urgent expression. Can't stop them. Shibi seemed to be talking to himself. Yes, we can't stop them. Many of the soldiers below the city had already surrendered. Actually, we can't blame them. The difference in strength between the two sides is too great. Plus, our brothers haven't had a full meal for a long time. We even killed more than half of our war horses. We don't have enough strength to continue fighting with them. The chilly arch explained to the soldiers below. After Tuachuo Buhua was ambushed by Yeshen and his brother Agar Dorj, he retreated under the protection of his loyal general. From that moment on, the 10,000 Tatar soldiers guarding the city of Tulu no longer had any supplies. As a rootless tree, in order to save themselves, they first launched an attack on the northern Ming territory by raiding grain and grass. However, not only did they not manage to steal much, they were also surrounded by the cavalry sent out by the northern Ming's Quan department. If it weren't for the Tatar cavalry's bravery, they would have suffered a great loss. Since Baiming's side didn't gain any benefits, they could only target the grasslands and rob some of the herdsmen. However, this kind of behavior quickly forced the people of the grassland nearby to flee even further away. When the food in the city became less and less, AMU Gulong had no choice but to order the slaughter of the horses. This was also the reason why there were 10,000 Tatar soldiers, but only 5,000 cavalry. Half of the missing horses were eaten by the Tatar soldiers themselves. They knew their own situation best. If the mercenaries were ordinary, the Tatar soldiers might be able to muster up the courage to fight, and maybe even steal some food from them. But now, facing the mercenaries who were clearly stronger than them, they would die if they continued to resist. Knowing this, it wasn't a big deal that some soldiers chose to surrender. Since the soldiers below the city have surrendered, Let's surrender too. Tell the brothers to stop resisting and surrender. Shibi let out a long sigh, as if he had made a very difficult decision. After saying these words, his whole body relaxed. It was as if from this moment on, he had put down a heavy burden on his body. White flags were suddenly hung on the city walls of Tulu City. Under the sunlight, they looked pale and powerless. When Tiger's Mane saw this scene, he laughed loudly. "Ha ha! The Tatar soldiers have surrendered. Enter the city." The mercenaries entered the city more than 2 hours earlier than planned. Tiger's Mane's original plan didn't fully unfold it. This made him full of disdain for the 5,000 Tatar soldiers guarding the city. The way he saw it, even with the advantage of the city, the resistance was so weak. The general guarding the city was too incompetent. However, all of this changed because of what he saw after entering the city. When Tiger's Mane entered the city, Su He and Xian Honghai had already completely controlled the situation here. Even Shibi and the others were brought down from the city tower. They knelt on the ground and waited for Tiger's Mane to inspect and inspect. Riding a tall horse into the city, Tiger's Mane originally wanted to ridicule the enemy's general and suppress the enemy's morale. But when his eyes fell on Shibi and the soldiers beside him, he was surprised to find that they didn't look like an army. They didn't look like the valiant and mighty grassland warriors at all. Each of them looked sallow and emaciated. Their clothes looked so big on their bodies. They looked like children wearing an adult's robe. It was so inappropriate. Of course, the Tatar soldiers weren't so poor that they didn't even have clothes to wear. The reason for this was because they were malnourished for a long time. They didn't have enough food to fill their stomachs. As a result, each of them had lost a few kilograms or more. This made them look so out of place with the clothes they were wearing. Tiger's Mane rode on his horse. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Commander Su He seemed to understand something. He rode his horse to his side and said, "Tiger's Mane, I've already asked around. These soldiers haven't eaten for a long time. They even used their horses to fill their stomachs." Speaking of this, Su He couldn't bear to see her like this. For the grassland warriors, the war horses were their brothers. Most of the time, the horses would be there if the men were still alive, and if the men were dead, the horses would also die. If they were to use their brothers as food, one could imagine how bad the environment would be. Not to mention, horse meat was sour and didn't taste very good. If it wasn't for the fact that they had no other choice, who would make such a decision? Arrange for the food to be cooked immediately. At least let them eat their fill first. Tiger's Mane suppressed all the words he wanted to say. He finally understood why the Tatar soldiers, who always looked powerful, were so useless today. Presumably, without food, even if they were mercenaries, how much of their strength could they display? Su He thanked Tiger's Mane on behalf of these soldiers. Hearing Tiger's Mane's order, Su He sighed. No matter what, he was still a Tatar. He was connected to these people by blood. Of course, he didn't want to see his own people in such a pitiful state. Seeing Su He's touched expression, Tiger's Mane chuckled. "Okay, go and pass down my order." "Oh, right, the commoners should be starving. Pass down the order to make a portion for them. Try to let everyone eat their fill." "Yes." Su He once again cupped his fists and thanked him. Then, as if he remembered something, he quickly saluted again and quickly rode away. Warm tears flowed out from the corners of his eyes. This time, he was really touched by Tiger's Mane's actions. The news of the victory reached Yang Chendong, who was slowly moving. Looking at the battle report, Tiger's Mane took down the entire Tulu city at the cost of less than 200 casualties and captured nearly 8,000 enemy soldiers. Yang Chendong laughed. "Not bad. Tiger's Mane did a good job." It looks like he has the talent to be a general. Seeing that Yang Chendong was in a good mood, Beta Persei quickly flattered him. That's right, Tiger's Mane is actually very capable of leading an army. After all, he has been by the young master's side for so long. Of course, there was another subtext to this sentence, which was that he had been by the young master's side for a long time and was also a talented commander. Naturally, Beta Persei wouldn't say these words out loud. He didn't forget the choice Yang Chendong gave him. He could either go down and be a regiment commander and lead an army, or he could obediently stay by his side. At that time, he chose the latter without hesitation. Towards Yang Chendong, besides admiration, Beta Persei also felt gratitude, because without this master, he might not even know where he would be right now, or whether he was alive or dead. It was precisely because of the sixth young master that he was able to bring him such wonderful things. Now that he was about to have a woman, the gratitude in his heart grew even stronger. He would never leave Yang Chendong's side, but if there was a chance to lead an army to the battlefield, he would also yearn for it. After all, men had such primitive impulses in their bones. Yang Chendong chuckled and didn't make any comments on Beta Persei's words. Instead, he waved his hand and said, "If that's the case, speed up the march. We'll rest in Tulu City today." The distance wasn't very far to begin with. In the afternoon, Yang Chendong and more than 1,000 people arrived at the foot of the city and entered the city together with Tiger's Mane and the others who were waiting there. Along the way, Tiger's Mane also gave a simple report on the battle that had happened. Previously, the scout had already reported the situation to Yang Chendong. Now, he just had to repeat it. Tiger's Mane spoke very quickly. After he finished talking about the battle, his expression became a little depressed. "Young master, the people here don't have it easy." Hearing Tiger's Mane say that the Tatar soldiers guarding the city didn't have it easy, Yang Chendong's face revealed a very strange expression. Why did he suddenly speak up for the other party? "Young master, the situation is like this." With a serious face, Ming recounted everything he had seen after entering the city, as well as everything he had learned about the situation. When he said that the Tatar soldiers in the city hadn't eaten a full meal for a long time, and that they had to kill war horses to satisfy their hunger, and that some of the people in the city had to trade their children for food in order to survive, Tiger's Mane clenched his teeth and clenched his right hand tightly. He had a very pained expression on his face. Yang Chendong's face darkened when he heard the words, "trade their children for food." Of course, he knew what this meant. Although he had been in this world for a few years and had seen many poor people, when he heard these words, he was still very moved. In his mind, he could even imagine what kind of situation the people had to be in to do such a thing. It must be quite a lot of helplessness, right? Presumably, the parents who did this would feel guilty for the rest of their lives, right? "Young master, I have already given the order to take out our rations and let the surrendered soldiers and the people have a full meal first. Please don't punish us." Tiger's Mane's voice sounded again, but when he said this, he already looked like he was asking for forgiveness. Speaking of which, it was reasonable to distribute the military rations to the surrendered soldiers. After all, these people might become his comrades in the future. However, distributing the rations to the people, even some women, children, and the elderly, was not something that Tiger's Mane could casually decide. Most of these people didn't have the strength to truss a chicken, so even if they had it in their hands, it wouldn't be very useful. Although the mercenaries already had 2,000 mu of greenhouses in the first city, which could solve a part of the food problem, most of the food still had to be transported by sea from Red Nest City. The manpower and material resources required were too large. Now that the military rations were distributed like this, Tiger's Mane should ask for forgiveness. Chapter 777. Hey, what crime have you committed? Yang Qindong casually waved his hand. Although we don't have the ability to let all the people in the world live a good life and eat their fill, as long as we are willing to work hard, this problem will eventually be solved. What you did was not wrong. Thank you, young master. Tiger's Mane also knew that since he had been by Yang Qindong's side for so long, he could still make this decision. Even if he was wrong, he would not be punished too much. However, he also had to show the appropriate attitude, because from a certain point of view, he was a servant, and Yang Qindong was the master. Yes, not only did you not do anything wrong, but you also contributed greatly to being able to take down Tulu City at such a small price. Actually, with the current strength of the independent regiment, you already have the conditions to become a division. How about this? I will now order you to be the division commander of the independent regiment. Later, I will send a telegram to the military and political department of Chichen City to let them organize the records. You should also put in some effort and report the names of the officers under you to them. Yang Qindong said with a chuckle. Tiger's Mane was his study companion. He had been following her since she was young, so she was very familiar with his temperament. Since he had such ability to command the army, of course he would do his best to promote him. Of course, he was the only one who knew if he had any other motives for doing this. Being promoted, all of a sudden, Ming was still in a daze. Beta Persei, who was at the side, had already come over with a smile on his face. Division Commander Tiger, congratulations. Remember to treat us to a meal later. Tiger's Mane only came to his senses after hearing this. While staring at Beta Persei, he also saluted Yang Qindong. Young master, I am someone by your side. This independent regiment is only a temporary proxy. I have no intention of leaving your side. Young master. Tiger's Mane was not thinking about the position of a division commander. With his status, who would dare to treat him like that even though he was the captain? Even Commander Wu Sheng and Political Commissar Chen Bo of the 3rd Division of the Cold Front Division would respectfully address themselves as his subordinates whenever they met him. Since that was the case, it didn't matter whether he was a teacher or not. On the contrary, if he was forced to leave Yang Qindong because he gained a teacher, then the loss would outweigh the gain. I didn't say that I wanted you to leave. Yang Qindong tilted his head and glanced at Tiger's Mane. He chuckled and said, Who said that you can't serve by my side after becoming a division commander? All right, don't think too much about it. If I let you be a division commander, just do it. Otherwise, it wouldn't be right for a regiment commander to always be a senior colonel. Tiger's Mane didn't care about Yang Qindong's military rank. He only cared that the young master wouldn't let him leave his side. Therefore, when he heard this, he chuckled and revealed a face full of gratitude. Let's go. Don't just laugh foolishly. Accompany me to take a look around the city. Yang Qindong pushed his legs and rode forward. Tiger's Mane, Beta Persei, and the others behind him also hurriedly followed and headed towards Tulu City. Tulu City was indeed terrifyingly poor. From afar, there didn't seem to be anything other than some dilapidated and dangerous houses. Speaking of which, it was just like Alakamaki before he became the first city. He was so poor that he didn't even have anything. Young master, this place is too poor. Should we transform this into a second first city? Tiger's Mane's emotions had stabilized, and he began to speak from a strategic point of view. There's no hurry. Yang Qindong slowly shook his head. How about this? Tell the people that if they don't want to stay here, they can arrange for them to live in the first city. As for this place, just leave the soldiers to guard it. Tulu City's geographical location was very important. According to Yang Qindong's previous intention, he wanted to occupy this important place and then build it into a city like the first city. But along the way, his thoughts had changed. After all, This place was too close to Baiming. 200 miles ahead was Baiming Swan Quan Department and Xian Mansion. If an accident happened, this place would become an isolated city. Not only did he need to arrange a heavy defense, but he also needed to be on guard against other people's attacks. This was not a good feeling, and it was not something Yang Chendong was happy about. Therefore, he hadn't made a final decision about the future of this city. He still needed to take a look. Since Yang Chendong said that he wasn't in a hurry, Tiger's Mane naturally wouldn't say anything. He just nodded and remained silent. In fact, in the entire Yangxia, once it was Yang Chendong's decision, it was equivalent to the final decision. No one would dare to challenge his authority. The days in winter were very short. After just walking around the streets, the sky had already darkened. The largest house in the city had become the temporary Yang Mansion and Yang Chendong's temporary residence. After entering the Yang Mansion, Yang Chendong ate a hot meal while listening to the news from the scout. After reporting that Luge was 2nd Regiment and the 3rd Regiment of recruits had landed at the corner tonight, he raised his head and gave instructions. Tell Commander Lu to be careful. Although the Tatar army suffered a loss last night, it doesn't mean that they won't come to cause trouble. Yes, 6th Young Master. The scout received a reply, saluted, and turned to leave. But as soon as he left, Tiger's Mane strode into the hall and came in front of Yang Chendong, who had already stuffed the last mouthful of rice into his mouth. Young Master, Commander Su He is here. He said that he has something to report to you. Ask him to wait in the hall. Yang Chendong took the towel from Beta Persei, wiped his hands, and nodded lightly. Tiger's Mane's previous report said that when facing the Tatar soldiers during the day, the 3,000 Tatar cavalry regiment didn't have the slightest intention of going easy. This made him very happy. At least it proved that this person understood the big picture. Even so, he should be properly comforted and rewarded. Soon, in the side hall, Su He, who was wearing a black cloak, was led by Tiger's Mane to Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table. He immediately saluted and said respectfully, Commander of the Tatar Cavalry Regiment, Su He, reporting to the 6th Young Master. Su He, your Tatar Cavalry Regiment performed well today. I have already passed down the order. Each soldier will record a military merit once. Those who killed the enemy will be rewarded accordingly. As the commander of the regiment, you have contributed the most. You will be rewarded with an additional 1,000 taels of silver, a pack of cigarettes, and 10 jars of good wine. Seeing the energetic Su He, Yang Chendong nodded in satisfaction. Thinking back, he had spent some effort and even risked entering the camp to persuade the other party to work for him. Now, it seemed that everything was worth it. Thank you, 6th Young Master, for the reward. Su, he saluted to show his gratitude. This made Tiger's Mane smile. However, this smile quickly changed because of Su He's next words. 6th Young Master, Su He does not dare to ask for a reward. If possible, these rewards can be returned. Su He has other requests. I hope that the 6th Young Master can fulfill my request. Tiger's Mane's expression changed. He actually dared to reject the 6th Young Master's reward. Wasn't this the same as slapping his face in front of everyone? In a fit of anger, he shouted at Su He, "What are you talking about? Don't forget your identity." Sigh. On the other hand, Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table, had a natural expression on his face. He did not show the slightest bit of unhappiness because of the other party's rejection of the reward. Instead, he asked with interest, "If you don't want the reward, then what do you want?" Sui's face was also red. Perhaps it was because of Tiger's Mane's reprimand, or perhaps it was because of Yang Chendong's smile. His heart could not help but beat like a drum. What kind of person was Yang Chendong? Although He did not have a complete understanding of him, the great Ming's Duke of loyalty and courage, the god of war, and the messenger of longevity heaven that the common people spoke of. Any one of these names alone had an illustrious reputation. Once such a person made a decision, how could he change his mind easily? Since he rejected the reward, the other party should be angry. However, this smile on his face made him even more puzzled. In fact, no one knew Yang Qindong's true identity. Even more so, they did not know that Yang Qindong did not attach much importance to some of the rules of the present age. Just like how he said before that there was no need to kneel when seeing him, all the soldiers who had undergone training were now used to this tradition. Perhaps in other people's eyes, rejecting a reward was a big deal. It was equivalent to rejecting the other party's good intentions. To put it more seriously, it was a slap in the face. If it was bestowed by the emperor, no matter if it was a gift or a marriage, if someone dared to reject it, it was equivalent to defying the imperial edict. That person's entire family would be beheaded. However, in Yang Qindong's eyes, he did not care about this at all. I gave you something to show that I think highly of you and reward you. If you don't want it, then I'll just take it back. This is not a big deal. This was Yang Qindong's true thought. He did not know this, which was why Tiger Mane was angry, and why He was so nervous. However, now that Yang Qindong had asked what he wanted, he had to say it even if his next words would anger the other party. Wasn't this the reason why he had taken the initiative to come here? With a plop, he did not salute but knelt on the ground. This action already showed his determination, and also seemed to indicate that what he was going to say next would not be so pleasant to hear. By the side, Mang's expression changed as well. Instead of the military salute, she knelt down. What did He want? Even Beta Persei, who was standing beside Yang Qindong, stared with a pair of tiger eyes. His whole body could not help but tense up. He was only waiting for the young master's next order to teach this he a lesson. He would make him suffer and teach him a lesson. Yang Qindong's expression did not change at all when he knelt. He only narrowed his eyes for a moment. Then he smiled gently and waited quietly. He was also very curious about what he was going to say. Chapter 778. He, who was kneeling with his head lowered, couldn't see the reactions of the others. After kneeling, he only wanted to say what he wanted to say. Sixth young master, he requests that you properly collect Amu Galong's corpse and send it to Tungri. Please spare the 8,000 captured Tatar soldiers. Although they opposed you before, they had no choice but to do so. Many of them had received kindness from Tuachuo Buhua Great Khan. They were just repaying their kindness. That's all. However, after today's battle, those kindness disappeared with the wind. I have talked with them, and many of them are willing to join the mercenary army. I hope that the sixth young master can help them. After saying everything she wanted to say, he lay on the ground again, as if she was prostrating herself on the ground. At the same time, she seemed to be saying that she had finished what she wanted to say. She could be dealt with by the sixth young master as he wished. After he finished speaking, the hall fell into silence. How was this one request? There were clearly several, especially the matter of collecting Amu Galong's corpse. In the eyes of the others, this was even more impossible. Since they were enemies, they had to be prepared to be beheaded. Moreover, who didn't know that the mercenary army loved to observe wherever they went? This was a great psychological deterrent. Not to mention, he had already tried to persuade Amu Galong to surrender. However, the facts proved that it was useless. Now that Amu Galong was defeated, the mercenary army defeated him with their own strength. Why did they have to bury him properly? Tiger's Mane, who knew everything, had a puzzled expression. He looked at Su-hee, who was kneeling on the ground, and said, "Commander Su, don't you think you are too much? AMU Gulang is our enemy. Why do you want to bury the enemy's corpse properly? Also, how should we deal with the captives? Is this something that a commander like you can consider or even question? Don't think that you have made a great contribution by killing AMU Gulang today. Let me tell you, I don't even need the young master to make a move. I can easily deal with you. Moreover, the other soldiers of the Tatar cavalry regiment won't have any doubts. Do you believe me?" Tiger's mane wasn't exaggerating. Although the majority of the Tatar cavalry were Tatars, and they were the Tatar cavalry under the leadership of Agadorji. However, after a few months of training, especially the political studies that took half an afternoon every week, many people's mentality had changed. At the end of the day, everyone was only willing to follow Agar Dorji because they wanted to live a better life. Later on, he surrendered with Su-hee and joined the mercenary group with the same mindset. Reality had proven that becoming a member of the mercenary group could solve the problem of food and clothing. Since that was the case, of course they would side with the mercenary group. Even if Su-hee had other thoughts and wanted to leave, there wouldn't be many soldiers who would make the same choice. In other words, the true leadership of Su-hee's Tatar cavalry regiment didn't lie with him as the commander, but with the higher-ups of the mercenary group in the hands of young Master Yang Chendong. Su-hee was naturally very clear about this point as a famous general. He didn't doubt Tiger's mane's words. He just lowered his head and said, "Commander Tiger, I don't want to do things based on merit. This is all my personal opinion and has nothing to do with the Tatar cavalry regiment. If you think I'm wrong, then punish me. I'll accept any punishment. Even if you want me to be an ordinary soldier, I'll accept the punishment. However, I hope that you and the 6th young master will seriously consider my request." Even though he knew this, Su-hee still didn't have any intention of relenting. This had already shown his determination. Because of this, Tiger's mane didn't know what to say. He could only glare at him angrily. Then he shifted his gaze to Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table. He believed that the 6th young master would have a way to resolve this matter. Yang Chendong had been listening attentively from the side. When he heard Su-hee's request and Tiger's mane's reprimand, he didn't make a sound. Now that everyone was silent, he coughed lightly and said, "Tiger's mane is right. AMU Gulang is our enemy." He didn't listen to persuasion and didn't take the opportunity we gave him seriously. Since he didn't take it, he's dead. Why should we collect the enemy's corpse? Commander Su, do you have any other reasons for this matter? Why don't you tell us? Yang Chendong said this calmly, without the slightest trace of anger. However, it was precisely because of this that Su-hee, who was kneeling on the ground, understood that this was the 6th young master giving him a chance to explain. If he didn't take it, he might really be punished. Originally, surrendering was something that he was forced to do. He thought that he would just be wasting his time anywhere. Therefore, he decided to enter the mercenary camp and take a good look. If it didn't work out, he would just look for an opportunity to leave. However, he never thought that the moment he entered the mercenary camp, he would really be infected by the atmosphere here. Here, officers and soldiers were all equal. They were particular about punishment for mistakes and rewards for meritorious deeds. Moreover, the military discipline was strict, and they would never make things difficult for ordinary citizens. Here, they could eat their fill, wear warm clothes, and have a beautiful future to look forward to. Wasn't all of this what he had been pursuing all his life? Su-hee naturally liked this place. He liked it from the bottom of his heart. Even if others wanted to chase him away, he was also sincerely unwilling. However, he still did it today because he knew that he had to do it. Now that the sixth young master gave him a chance to explain, he cherished it very much. He slowly raised his head and looked at Yang Qindong, who was sitting there with an expectant look, and said, "Sixth young master, I did it because it was not only my idea, but also the idea of the 8,000 captive Tatar soldiers. I have talked with this person and found that he is a rare talent. I wanted him to be used by the sixth young master, but he made this request. So he didn't say what so, but he believed that the sixth young master would be able to guess it. Yang Qindong's expression didn't change much. When Suhi knelt down and said the request, he already guessed something, and Suhi's answer was no different from his guess. "Well, tell me in detail." "Yes, sixth young master. As far as I know, Amu Gulong was an orphan when he was young. His parents were killed by the enemy. He grew up eating the food of hundreds of families. Later, he met the great Khan Tuachuo Butuo and was raised by him. He was someone the great Khan trusted greatly. Later, he was arranged to guard Tulu City. Because of this, even though he knew that he had no chance of winning against the mercenaries, he still made the decision to fight. He wanted to use his life to repay the great Khan's kindness. Even though he knew that he would die, he still did it. Isn't this loyalty worthy of respect? Furthermore, this subordinate also learned from the other captives that when there was no food in Tulu City, Amu Gulong did not rely on his status as a general to steal the soldiers' rations. On the contrary, he ate whatever the ordinary soldiers ate. He set a very good example, which also made him hold a very high position in the hearts of the soldiers. If we can properly collect his corpse, the other Tatar soldiers will definitely be grateful. This will play a better role in the future when we incorporate them into our forces. Of course, the reason why I made this request is to let go of this person. I originally thought that he was just a deputy general by Amu Gulong's side, but after a long conversation between the two of us in the afternoon, I realized that this person had lofty ambitions. In terms of the overall situation, even I was inferior to him. After that, I learned that this person also didn't have a good background. His mother was a Han, and his Mongolian bloodline wasn't pure. Therefore, he had no room to display his strength. Such a person should be the one the sixth young master took a fancy to. I advised him to follow the sixth young master, and he raised the issue of burying Amu Gulong properly. He also said that this was his promise. If he couldn't fulfill this promise, he would rather die. Wasn't such a loyal and affectionate person the sixth young master was looking for. That's why I boldly suggested this, and asked the sixth young master to approve. After finally saying all the reasons, he once again placed his head on the ground, looking like he was at his disposal. More than once, he mentioned the name of "I'm leaving." Even Yang Qindong was curious. He was very clear about Suhi's ability. He was already a rare warlord, and the person he admired must be outstanding. "Beta Persei, go and bring that person called. I'm leaving." Seeing is better than hearing 100 times. Since Suhi described this person so well, Yang Qindong wanted to see if it was true or not. Beta Persei agreed and walked out. Not long after, he walked into the hall with a man with a thin face and big eyes. As soon as he entered, Beta Persei shouted in a loud voice, "This is the sixth young master, the god of war in your mouth. Kneel down." Greetings to the great Ming's Duke of Loyalty. After Beta Persei said these words, the "I'm leaving" had already obediently knelt down. On the contrary, Beta Persei, who was prepared to help the "I'm leaving," was stunned. He could only sigh in his heart, "At least you know what's good for you." He stood at the side and stared at him to prevent him from doing anything that would be detrimental to the young master. Yang Chendong did not pay attention to these small movements. Instead, his gaze fell on the extremely thin "I'm leaving." Rather than saying he was thin, it was better to describe him as thin as a match. It was only because his bones were wide that he did not give others the impression that he was very thin. Just like his big eyes, they might not have been that big originally. It was only because his face was too thin that it made his eyes look big. Chapter 779. With just one look, Yang Chendong could imagine what kind of life the 10,000 Tatar soldiers were living. According to Su He, Shibi was second only to Amu Gulong. If even he was so thin, one could imagine what kind of life the other ordinary soldiers were living. These thoughts just flashed through his mind. Yang Chendong looked at Shibi, who was kneeling on the ground, and said, "I heard from Commander Su He that your mother is Han? How can you prove it?" It was no wonder that Yang Chendong would ask such a question. He still valued Han blood. Wasn't there a saying? Those who were not of the same race would have different hearts. If it could be proven that Shibi was really a Han descendant and had the ability, he could be put in an important position. She did not expect Yang Chendong's first question to be this. She seemed to be a bit surprised that she was willing to part, but her expression quickly regained its calm. She then used a perfectly articulated voice to reply, "Duke of loyalty and courage. My mother once said that her ancestral home was from Suzhou. My mother's ancestors even had some wealth. However, because they later offended someone, the entire family was sent to the border. In one battle, the city was broken into. My mother also became a spoil of war. Later, she was snatched by my father and gave birth to me." After a series of explanations, Shibi smiled bitterly. "My parents are now gone. I know that there is no way to find out. However, when I was young, my mother liked to hum some Suzhou tunes when she was free. I unintentionally learned some. Now, I will sing it for Duke of Loyalty and everyone." Shibi didn't care if anyone was willing to listen. He started to sing. Although there were no instruments, even if he sang without the help of instruments, it still had a special charm. When Yang Chendong heard this, he roughly determined Shibi's identity. He had heard Suzhou's songs before. In the past, Lady Shui and Lady Xiang had often played them in front of him. Although Shibi was limited by the condition of his voice, the charm of it had been sung by him. This was very difficult. Think about it. If he didn't really hear about it or was influenced by it, why would a Tatar cavalry learn such a useless thing? Moreover, if one looked closely at Shibi's face, they would notice that he was different from the Mongols. For example, his skin color and expression were similar to many Han people. Not to mention, the great Ming dynasty and the Mongols had been at war for many years. There were many cases where the great Ming dynasty was involved in the war. Yang Chendong didn't have any doubts about his mother's identity as a Han, so he nodded. "Okay, you don't have to think about your background. General Su, he said that you have extraordinary abilities. How can you prove it?" He. Shibi chuckled. "Commander Su, he is too kind. Actually, I'm just a captive. How could I have any ability? It's just that I have a different view of the current situation compared to others." The first part was just a polite remark. The second part was the most important thing. Naturally, it attracted Yang Chendong's curiosity. "What do you think of the situation?" "Yes," Shibi solemnly replied, and said, "During the day, I was fortunate enough to meet Commander Su He. We talked about the mercenary army. In my opinion, the mercenary army's growth is inevitable. In fact, no one can stop it." "Why?" Yang Chendong asked in a concise manner. "There is only one reason. The Duke of Loyalty and Courage is sincerely thinking for the common people. That's enough." His face was full of confidence. If one looked closely, There was even a sense of heroism. Spai's voice became louder and louder. Looking at the entire grassland, and even the world, there are countless people who claim to be working for the common people. However, how many of them can do it? On the grassland, the tribes are constantly fighting. Today you fight me. Tomorrow I fight you. The day after tomorrow, they fight you. In the end, it's all about fighting for resources and money. Who has truly thought for the common people? Who has seriously considered that what the common people really want is peace? Look at the great Ming dynasty. It seems that the land is tens of thousands of miles long, and there are many people. However, how many of the common people are able to have enough food and clothing? Are they truly satisfied? Especially in recent years, after the great Ming dynasty was divided into North and South, the people in power thought about how to unify the world and leave their names in history. In order to achieve these goals, they can only compete with the common people. They snatch gold, silver, and even rations from the common people. However, they don't know that doing so has already made them lose the hearts of the people. Even if they can unify the world one day, it will only be a temporary glory. They don't know that the common people are the foundation of a country. Only when their lives are truly good and their hearts are at peace will the world be stable. Among them, many have long forgotten that water can carry a boat, but it can also capsize a boat. At this time, Spai was more like an old master talking about the general trend of the world. Many of the things he said were reasonable and well-founded. Even Tiger's Mane and Beta Persei, who were standing on both sides of him, nodded their heads in approval from time to time. Not to mention Yang Chendong, who was sitting at the head of the table. This was the first general he had come into contact with who put the hearts of the common people first. In the past, there were also people who talked about the hearts of the people. For example, Yu Qian was such a person. He cared about the lives of the common people very much and cared about their thoughts. Therefore, this person became the Castellan of Qiqian City. Facts had also proved that this person had done a very good job and had solved Yang Chendong's worries. And now, another person had appeared. It was conceivable that once Yang Chendong recognized this person's ability, he would be entrusted with an important task. That's right. At some point in time, Shibi had stopped his long-winded speech. His entire aura changed as well. He once again assumed the appearance of a sinner. He knelt there with his head lowered, looking like he was waiting to be dealt with. However, Yang Chendong's voice also sounded. He finally understood why he would rather not give him any benefits and bury Amu Gulong properly. It seemed like he also saw that Spai was a talent. Yes, Spai, you indeed have different knowledge from others. Since it's like this, are you willing to join the mercenary army? Yang Chendong said with a straight face. In ancient times, common people were not that important. Although there were many people who would often say it, reality had already proven that there were not many people who could really do it. This made Spai's gaze even more shocking. Sinner is willing, but Sinner still has a request. Spai's heart calmed down. He knew that his view should be the same as Yang Chendong's, so he took the opportunity to raise a request. Logically speaking, since he was already a sinner, he should not raise any conditions. However, it was obvious that Yang Chendong was in a good mood. Previously, Sui had fought a battle, so Yang Chendong was not angry. Instead, he chuckled. Pass down the order, collect Amu Gulong's corpse, and bury it properly. Allow 8,000 captives and the common people in the city to watch the ceremony. Considering that they have been malnourished for a long time, let them return to the logistics team of the first city and join the construction team. Let them work while recuperating. After they recover their fighting strength, we will consider joining the army. This matter will be handed over to Division Commander Tiger to handle. Yes. Tiger's mane hurriedly lowered his head and replied, "Thank you, Duke of Loyalty. I have nothing else to ask for. I am willing to join the mercenary army and will never regret it." Without waiting for him to speak, Yang Chendong had already satisfied all his conditions. He immediately kowtowed to the ground again, indicating his determination. Ha ha ha! Yang Chendong laughed loudly. It could be seen that he was really happy this time. Tulu City had been breached, so there was no distance between Yang Chendong and Ming. Looking at the road to Xian Mansion, the situation seemed to have become even more complicated. Xian Mansion, it was not an exaggeration to say that Ming was the northern gate of the capital. Once one entered here, one could pass through the wooden fortress and enter Huai Lai. After passing through the Jiong Pass, one would be in the capital. Naturally, Ming had also put in a lot of effort here. He had arranged for a large number of troops, and the command center of the Wonquan Metropolitan was in Xian Mansion. The Wonquan Metropolitan was the same administrative level as the new Urgon Metropolitan. Metropolitan Commander Shi Wanshan was a second-rank military official in the imperial court. Not only that, he was also a scholar who was good at war and good at strategizing. This had to do with Shi Wanshan's background. His father was a scholar, and because he was forced to make a living, he was sponsored by a few wealthy gentry in the village to open a school. He only taught the children of the village, but he was truly capable and knew a lot. Whenever he spoke of something, others would quickly understand and accept it. It was precisely in this environment that Shi Wanshan had slowly grown up. Influenced by what he saw and heard, he began to understand many principles. He had originally wanted to follow his father's example and rely on what he had learned to obtain scholarly honors so that he could contribute to the great Ming. In truth, when he was only a teenager, he had inherited his father's mantle and become a scholar. He seemed to have a bright future ahead of him, but at this time, an incident occurred that changed the course of his life. In the second year after he became a scholar, a group of passing bandits suddenly attacked the village and killed many people. At that time, his father and family all died under the blades of the bandits. Because he was still young, he was taken away by the bandits as a laborer. In the end, he went up the mountain and became a coolie in the bandits' lair. There were dozens of young people who were taken up the mountain with him. In such an environment, they were scared to death. However, Shi Wanshan was the only one who was not afraid of power. He stood up and criticized the bandits for all kinds of wrong things, and even proposed all kinds of solutions. If one wanted to reason with the bandits, there was no difference between negotiating with the king of hell. However, he was amazing because he could still propose some solutions to the problem. The bandits followed his suggestions and soon found that things had become much simpler. As a result, Shi Wanshan probably did not expect that he would be valued by the bandits. The defense of the mountain and how to develop in the future all fell into his hands. Chapter 780. Reality proved that gold would shine no matter where it was. Shi Wanshan suppressed the hatred in his heart and began to wholeheartedly help the bandits expand their power. At the same time, he also learned to blend in and learn some of the strengths of these people. Slowly, he learned martial arts with the bandits. Under his hard work, he gained a good ability. Then he used his knowledge to lead the bandits to clear out the nearby bandits one by one. In the end, he used more than 10 years to develop himself to a very powerful level. He himself also had a very high reputation among the bandits. It was also at this time that Shi Wanshan no longer suppressed himself. The seeds of hatred that had been planted in him for many years finally erupted. He led some of his trusted aides to kill the head of the bandit lair, which was the bad guy who had killed his family and fellow villagers. Then he took the head down the mountain and took the initiative to ask for punishment from the nearby yamen. He also told them about his background and the things he had done in order to take revenge over the years. Just like that, the local yamen, which had been a headache for the local yamen, was wiped out in one fell swoop. At that time, the yamen received a lot of money and other benefits from Shi Huanshan and reported this matter to the emperor at that time, Zhu Qizhen. The emperor was very pleased, and Shi Huanshan changed from a bandit to an official. Then he developed step by step in the army. In the end, he relied on the gold and silver he had accumulated as a bandit to pave the way. In addition to his extraordinary ability, he rose step by step. When the Tumul Castle incident came out, Shi Huanshan keenly grasped this opportunity. Not only did he vigorously support the acting emperor, Zhu Qiyu, in his actions, he also used gold and silver to pave the way. Finally, he contacted the chief eunuch, Jining, and expressed his admiration. Finally, step by step, he became the commander of the Department of 10,000 Affairs, a dignified second-grade military official. The history of Shi Huanshan's rise to power was somewhat bizarre and complicated. However, he was proficient in both civil and military affairs. He was also generous with his money. Very quickly, he gained a firm foothold. Not only did he have a high position in the military, but he also enjoyed a good reputation among the civil officials. After all, he was a scholar, and his father was also a scholar. In a way, he could be considered a descendant of a scholarly family. For revenge, he had endured for many years, which was in line with Confucianism. Such a person was more likely to be trusted by the civil officials than other military generals. It was also because Shi Huanshan was strong that in the year he was in charge of the Wan'al division, there were rarely any Mongol cavalry around the Xian manor that he was in charge of. The only time Mu Wanggulang led an army to attack him, he was easily defeated by him, which further established his reputation. Shi Huanshan was naturally overjoyed to be able to achieve such brilliant achievements at the age of 35. He always had a smile on his face and was called amiable by his subordinates. However, in the past few days, the smile on his face had obviously lessened by a lot and was replaced by a kind of worry. News of Tala's capture had already spread. This meant that he would no longer have to face the Tatar cavalry, but the mercenary army that gave him a headache. Shi Huanshan had naturally heard about the mercenary army. It was precisely because of the appearance of this army that the northern Ming dynasty's regime was saved from collapse, allowing it to display its vitality once again. Although Shi Huanshan had not taken part in the defense of the capital, he had still understood the situation from the mouths of many people. He had always thought highly of the firearms used by the mercenary army and the extremely strong military quality of the mercenary soldiers, and he was also somewhat fearful of them. The mercenary army had been tormenting the southern Ming Empire, and it was said that they had even conquered 2 small countries. Shi Huanshan had also paid attention to these matters, but because he was too far away, he did not feel much pressure. But now, the mercenary army was right in front of him. It was not something that he could avoid just because he did not want to. In the residence of the prefectural commander of Xuanfu City, Shi Huanshan summoned 2 of his deputies, Commanders Ancient River, a minor rank 2 general, and Prefectural Commander Ning Wenfeng, a major rank 3 general. The 3 of them were seated in a side hall drinking wine. With Shi Huanshan's methods, it didn't take long for the 2 deputies to submit to him. It could be said that they listened to his every word. Therefore, when the 3 of them met, they didn't care about etiquette. This was also the reason why they met in the side hall instead of the main hall. You already know the situation. Tell me what you think. Shi Huanshan lightly tapped the jade table with his right hand, his gaze passing between Ancient River and Ning Wenfeng. What else can we do? After all, the Duke of Loyalty was conferred by the Emperor. Since they conquered Toulouse City, it's the same as helping us conquer Toulouse City. Send someone to take over the city's management rights. Commander Ancient River's voice was loud and clear as he spoke very casually. No. After he finished speaking, the Commander Ning Wenfeng at the side immediately waved his hand. As his name suggested, Ning Wenfeng did not seem like an ordinary general. Instead, he had the elegance of a scholar. In fact, without knowing his position, very few people would associate him with a general. In fact, his skills on horseback were quite good. He was also someone who was both civil and martial. Back then, in order to subdue him, Shi Wanshan had spent a lot of effort. At the very least, he had put in more effort than when he had subdued Ancient River. It was precisely because he had put in so much effort that this person's abilities were proven. When Ning Wenfeng said no, Shi Wanshan slightly raised his eyebrows. His eyes flashed with an appreciative smile. It was clear that he already knew what the other party meant. Guhi, on the other hand, asked casually, Why not? Don't tell me that the Duke of Loyalty dares to defy the imperial court's decree, no matter how powerful he is. Does he dare to openly oppose our Ming? The words openly oppose already proved that Ancient River had seen through the mystery. He was not a stupid person. Thinking about it, if he was a stupid person, how could he become a secondary second-rank military official? How could Shi Wanshan have spent so much effort to subdue him? Ha ha! Ning Wenfeng giggled in response to Ancient River's question. Knowing the other party's temperament, he knew that the other party was not targeting him and was just stating the facts. He continued, Toulouse City's location is very important, just like our Xian Manor. It can be considered one of the gateways for the Mongolian cavalry to enter our northern Ming. With them here, we only need to keep an eye on their movements to stabilize the situation. This is also the main reason why we have not attacked Toulouse City for so long. Otherwise, a city defended by only 10,000 people, how hard do you think it is to chew on a bone? When he said this, Ning Wenfeng's face was filled with arrogance. It could be seen that he was also a conceited person. The reason why they did not attack Toulouse City before was because they considered the importance of its location. Once they broke through, they would have to face even more attacks and harassment from the Mongol cavalry. No matter how they looked at it, it was not worth it. Rather than taking down a useless city, it would be better to place it right under their noses. It would be safer. Ning Wenfeng's words received a nod from Shi Wanshan and Ancient River. Clearly, the three of them had the same opinion on this matter. Then Ning Wenfeng continued, Now that the mercenaries have taken down Toulouse City, we'll just give it to them. With them in front of us, we can sit back and do what we want to do without any worries. Didn't the commander say to the court that we want to form and train a new army? Although we did not get a reply, we did not put in much effort and were only probing. I think we can increase our efforts and think about the practical problems. Ning Wenfeng's words could be said to have pointed out the current situation. What he said was very similar to Shi Wanshan's thoughts. This also caused the commander to laugh heartily. That's right, Wenfeng's words are extremely correct. With someone guarding the gate for us, we can free up our hands and do more things. How about this? I will immediately write a memorial and greet some of the important officials in the court. It should be time for the new army to train. In the Xian Manor, they discussed and came up with a plan. They adopted the strategy of responding to changes by remaining unchanged and watching the situation develop with a smile. They wanted to use the mercenaries to guard the gate of Toulouse City for them while vigorously developing and strengthening themselves. But what they did not expect was that the mercenaries who should be stabilizing Tulu City and digesting the fruits of their labor would brave the snow and come to the Xian Manor. Of course, there weren't many mercenaries. At most, there were only a few hundred of them. But among these few hundred people, there was the Duke of Loyalty and Courage. This was not a small matter. When he heard his subordinate report that the Duke of Loyalty and Courage had personally come to the city gate, Shi Wanshan, who was reading in the study, was shocked. He quickly put on his armor, called for his personal guards, and left the manor to go up the city gate tower. As he rushed up the city gate tower, Shi Wanshan was still puzzled. He could not understand why the Duke of Loyalty and Courage, who had taken down Tulu City, did not properly digest the fruits of victory there and strengthen the city's defenses. Why did he come to the Xian Manor? What did he want to do? Shi Wanshan did not know that the so-called digestion of fruits, in the eyes of others, might be a long process, but in the eyes of Yang Qindong, who was already prepared, it was just a matter of a few words. He only needed to send the civilians who wanted to leave the city, as well as the captured Tatar soldiers, to the first city at the rear. The road from Tulu City to the first city had already been cleared by Lu Shua of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment and the 3 new regiments, which could ensure the transportation of people and supplies. With this as a prerequisite, the distance of 7 to 800 li was not much of a problem. As for Tulu City, 2 battalions of soldiers were left behind to maintain normal operations. It should be known that it was winter, not a good time for battle. No one would easily have any ideas about Tulu City. Chapter 781. Yang Qindong only used 3 days to arrange all of this. Afterwards, he brought the Black Cavalry, the Wolf Fang Special Forces, and the Ghost Shadow Sniper Squad to Shangshuan City. He was preparing to celebrate the New Year in Baiming's capital this year. Since he had set his goal, he wouldn't change it easily. He only brought around 200 cavalry to Xuanfu City. Yang Qindong raised his head to look at the city that had been strengthened by Shi Wanshan and loudly announced his name. The Duke of Loyalty had actually come in person, causing the soldiers guarding the city to panic. They hurriedly reported the news. Then, all of the soldiers stared at Yang Qindong, who was wearing a red robe. They were both excited and somewhat fearful. Yang Qindong wasn't an ordinary duke. He had another nickname, the God of War. Facts had also proven that this person didn't disgrace this title. Wherever he went, all of the battles he fought were always victorious. This had even spread his name. Now that such a famous person had appeared in front of their eyes, it was reasonable for the soldiers guarding the city to be curious, excited, and even a bit scared. Shi Wanshan hurriedly arrived at the city. Ancient River, Ning Wenfeng, and the others had also just arrived. Immediately, everyone climbed up the city gate tower and saw the great Ming's Duke of Loyalty, Yang Qindong. Shi Wanshan had seen Yang Qindong from afar before, so he had some impression of him. It had only been less than 2 years. With this glance, he immediately confirmed the person's identity. He immediately whispered to Ancient River, Ning Wenfeng, and the others beside him, "It is indeed the Duke of Loyalty." His identity was verified, and he couldn't see any large army ambushing him. Shi Wanshan chuckled and loudly said, "I didn't know that the Duke of Loyalty had come. I'm sorry for not going out to meet you. I've sinned. How about this? I'll immediately order people to open the city gates. Duke of Loyalty, please wait for a moment." Well said, well said. With a smile, Yang Qindong gave people a very gentle feeling. He immediately recognized the person who had shouted on the city wall. It was Shi Wanshan, the commander of the all-encompassing army. In Yang Xie's security bureau, according to Yang Qindong's instructions, they not only needed detailed information about important targets and people, but also needed portraits and other evidence. Otherwise, Wouldn't it be a big joke if they only knew his name and met him one day, but didn't recognize him? Therefore, Yang Qindong had seen the portrait of an important figure like Shi Wanshan many times, so it was not surprising that he could recognize him immediately. The thick and heavy city gates slowly opened without making any other sound. With the cooperation of more than a dozen Ming soldiers, the city gate was soon opened. Shi Wanshan and the others were also approaching on horseback. As he watched the city gates open, Yang Qindong smiled and quickly analyzed the situation in his mind. Then, from this small matter, he came to a conclusion. This Shi Wanshan should be ready to attack at any time, eyeing Tulu City like a tiger eyeing its prey. Otherwise, the opening of the North City Gate would not have been so easy. One had to know that if a city gate was left untouched for a long time, it would rust. Once it was opened, it would emit creaking noises. However, there was no such sound now. It was obvious that this gate had been opened often in the past. It was self-evident what this meant. Shi Wanshan did not expect that such a small matter would lead to so many things. At this moment, he was still riding his horse with a smile on his face. When he was 5 meters away from Yang Qindong, he jumped off his horse. Then he lowered his head and said respectfully, "Commander of the Department of Wanquan, Shi Wanshan greets the Duke of Loyalty." Duke, Marquis, and Count. These 3 titles had very different statuses. If the other party was only a Marquis, Shi Wanshan would not have to bow like this. However, a duke was different. Yang Qindong also had the title of war god. He enjoyed a very high status in the army. It was normal for him to bow like this. When Shi Wanshan got off his horse, Ancient River, Ning Wenfeng, and the others behind him also got off their horses to greet him. Yang Qindong did not move from his horse. He just nodded and said, "Commander Shi, thank you for your hard work. Generals, thank you for your hard work." Yang Qindong's attitude made the generals unhappy. They had given him so much face. No matter what, he should have gotten off his horse and said something. Even if it was just a greeting, it should have been enough. Now, with so many generals saluting and you sitting on your horse, what would the soldiers on the city gate tower think if they saw this scene? This was the result that Yang Qindong wanted to achieve. He wanted to use this method to let the Ming soldiers know who was the boss. Moreover, this action should not be underestimated. It would greatly increase Yang Qindong's reputation. Just like now, when the soldiers on the city gate tower looked at Yang Qindong, their gazes became much more reverent. Shi Wanshan was also a bit annoyed. With his intelligence, he naturally knew why Yang Qindong did this. However, he couldn't say anything. It was just this small matter that made him put away his pride and pay more attention to Yang Qindong. In the past, Shi Wanshan was rarely at a disadvantage, even if it was a small matter. But now, the 2 sides had just met, and he had suffered losses. Not only did this not make Shi Wanshan angry, but it also made him more cautious. It had to be said that this was a character. After the 2 sides greeted each other, Shi Wanshan and the others accompanied Yang Qindong into the city. In Xianfu City, many of the citizens who lived here walked onto the streets. Many of them had heard of Yang Qindong's great name. Now that they came out, it was only because they wanted to pay their respects to him out of curiosity. With so many citizens suddenly walking on the streets, Shi Wanshan was afraid that something would happen. He immediately ordered Ancient River and the others to send out troops to maintain order. However, Yang Qindong waved his hand with a smile. "Sai, this is the enthusiasm of the citizens. How can we disappoint them? It's fine." After saying this, Yang Qindong took the initiative to wave to the onlookers while riding on the horse. He even cupped his fist and saluted when he saw some older elders. his respect for the elders was vividly reflected, and he quickly won the favor of many people. In ancient times, many people valued filial piety. Some dynasties directly governed the world with benevolence and filial piety. Yang Qindong's current actions were in line with the national conditions of that time. It was also a way to quickly win the hearts of the citizens. After spending close to 2 hours, Yang Qindong and the others finally arrived at the commander's residence. Shi Wanshan warmly invited them to welcome the Duke of Loyalty. Along the way, Yang Qindong appeared to be greeting the citizens, but in reality, he was observing the situation in Xianfu through these matters. He noticed that the people here were in good spirits and wore thick clothes. Their living conditions should be passable. Sure, Wanshan couldn't help but look at him in a higher light. No matter what, Xianfu was considered a border city. In a city like this, the appearance of the commoners should have a lot to do with this commander. Yang Qindong was curious about capable people. He naturally wouldn't reject Shi Wanshan's invitation. He smiled and nodded in agreement. Soon, the mansion became bustling with activity. Shi Wanshan knew how to conduct himself. Not only did he arrange a sumptuous banquet to invite Yang Qindong, he also warmly entertained the 200 cavalrymen he brought with him. Good wine and good meat were served. Then, he happily arranged for Song Wenfeng to represent him in receiving the guests. As he walked to the main table, he gave the other party a thoughtful look. Song Wenfeng smiled and nodded. She seemed to understand the commander's intentions and warmly greeted the 200 cavalrymen. At the main table, Yang Qindong sat at the head, followed by Shi Wanshan, Ancient River, and the others accompanied them, toasting to each other. The atmosphere was very harmonious. During the banquet, Shi Wanshan constantly spoke words of admiration. For example, Yang Qindong had led the mercenaries to defeat Yes Hen, won the battle to defend the capital, and raised the prestige of Ming. He also heard that he had taken care of a few ignorant foreigners in the south and strengthened the prestige of the great Ming army. Yang Qindong only smiled and modestly declined these words. He didn't show any arrogance because of these things. Shi Wanshan saw all of this and was even more shocked. How could this young man who looked to be in his early 20s have such a calm temperament? How did he train himself to be like this? Thinking back to when he was in his early 20s, he was still suppressing his temperament in the bandits' lair. However, at that time, he was also very hot-tempered. He definitely couldn't be as indifferent as Yang Qindong. At the same time that Yang Qindong became more important, he was even more curious about the other party's sudden appearance in Xian Manor. After 3 rounds of wine and 5 dishes, he pretended to be slightly drunk and asked, "Duke, I wonder if there is something important that you have suddenly come to my Xian Manor this time?" No. Yang Qindong still had a smile on his face as he replied, "No." Then what is the purpose of the High Duke's visit? Gui pretended to be puzzled and asked, I'm just passing by. After all, I'm going to Ming's capital, and the Xian residence is a place that I can't avoid." Yang Qindong still had a smile on his face as he replied, as if he was talking about an extremely ordinary and simple matter. But it was precisely this sentence that caused Gui's expression to greatly change. Even Shi Wanshan, who was at the side, had a shocked expression flash across his face. However, his reaction was very quick, and he immediately returned to normal. "Duke, you're going to the capital?" Gui was truly shocked. Logically speaking, with Yang Qindong's current status, even if he wasn't an enemy of the great Ming, he couldn't be considered a friendly friend either. As the saying went, a gentleman would not stand next to a collapsing wall. If he continued to stay outside, given the strength he had displayed, neither Ming nor the southern Ming would casually fall out with him. But if he personally went to the capital, it would be like a bird flying into a cage. What would happen next would be beyond his control. Chapter 782. It was such a simple logic that anyone could see it. How could the Guild of Loyalty not understand it? Yet, he still made such a choice. What was he planning to do? Was he not afraid of death? It wasn't just Ancient River. Everyone else was also shocked. However, some people acted well and didn't show it, while others' faces betrayed everything. Yang Qindong took in everyone's expressions from the corner of his eyes. Then he smiled and said, "I was originally a citizen of the great Ming. Last time, I returned to my hometown to pay respects to my ancestors. I was also requested by Emperor Ingzong of the southern Ming dynasty. Moreover, Emperor Ingzong allowed me to go to the south. Now that my mission is complete, I naturally have to return to Baiming. I have a young village outside of Baiming's capital. There are still 2 madams there." What he said was incomparably natural and also a kind of truth. However, whether this was the truth or not, no one knew. Speaking of the Yang village 15 li south of the capital, there were very few people who didn't know about it. It was said that there were many people who wanted to pay their respects to it. However, it was said that the place was heavily guarded and outsiders were not allowed to enter. As for the 2 madams there, in the eyes of outsiders, they were just hostages. Now that Yang Qindong said that he was going home, naturally no one believed him. However, regardless of whether they believed it or not, since Yang Qindong said this in front of everyone, they naturally pretended to understand. The madams discussed this topic and raised their cups to drink again. What they talked about were all strange things. It was purely a topic of conversation at the table. The welcoming banquet lasted for more than 2 hours before it finally ended. Under Shi Wanshan's warm invitation, Yang Qindong and the cavalry stayed in the commander's courtyard. The residents had also cleared out the entire northern courtyard. There were dozens of rooms there, and it was more than enough to accommodate these people. After Yang Qindong and the others entered the northern courtyard, they quieted down. Shi Wanshan saw that there was nothing else to tell him. He smiled and left, saying that he would come again tomorrow morning to pay his respects. Then he returned to the eastern courtyard. Ancient River and Ning Wenfeng were already waiting there. "How is it?" After entering the side hall, Shi Wanshan found a seat at the head of the table and took a sip of strong tea. Then his gaze fell on Ning Wenfeng. Earlier, he had intentionally sent this person to entertain those cavalrymen because he wanted to see if he could get any information from them. Unfortunately, Ning Wenfeng shook his head. "Commander, those cavalrymen only ate. They didn't even take a sip of wine. From the beginning to the end, they didn't even say a few words. Their lips are really tight. We can't get any useful information." However, in the end, Ning Wenfeng still left something unsaid, which attracted the attention of Shi Wanshan and Ancient River. They all knew that something must have been discovered. However, through this banquet, I discovered one thing, and that is that these cavalrymen seem to be treated very well. There are some big fish and meat on the table, and most of it is fatty meat. However, I found that they only eat lean meat. I think this is because they are used to eating such things. When Ning Wenfeng talked about this, he kept shaking his head. It was obvious that he was somewhat surprised in his heart. One must know that because the ancient people's living conditions were not good, and they didn't have enough oil. Under normal circumstances, fatty meat was more desirable. Only those who were used to eating fish would choose to eat lean meat. Just this alone was enough to explain a lot of problems. Shi Wanshan couldn't help but nod his head. The scouts have also reported that the meals and treatment of the mercenaries have always been very good. This confirms the authenticity of this matter. Ancient River, who was sitting there, saw that the two of them were talking about food. He couldn't help but say anxiously, "Hey, now is the time. Why do we still care about those things?" In my opinion, we should immediately send a large number of troops to surround the northern courtyard and capture the Duke of Loyalty. Then we can hand him over to the imperial court. That would be a great merit. No. When Ancient River finished speaking, Ning Wenfeng hurriedly shook his head to stop him. Originally, Shi Wanshan also wanted to object. However, when he heard Ning Wenfeng speak first, he didn't rush to express his opinion. Instead, he asked with a smile, "Wenfeng, why not?" "Commander, the Duke of Loyalty is not easy to deal with, especially the mercenaries under him. Even the Emperor is very wary of them. Right now, we haven't figured out the intentions of the higher-ups, so we can't just make a decision. What's more, if we touch the Duke of Loyalty, the mercenaries will definitely take action. Once they're angered, they'll launch an all-out attack on us. Not to mention whether our Xian Manor will be able to hold on. Will the higher-ups hand us over to stabilize the situation?" Ning Wenfeng's thoughts were so far-sighted that Shi Wanshan nodded his head repeatedly. At the same time, Ancient River's face was filled with shock. Yes, yes. If we make a move now, the imperial court might be happy for a while, but once the mercenaries make a fuss, the higher-ups will probably push us out as scapegoats. We can't do something like that. Ah, if only Eunuch Deng was here. The eunuch Deng that Ancient River spoke of was the eunuch guardian of the Xian Manor, Deng Chong. A while ago, the emperor wanted to know the situation here and summoned him back to the capital for questioning. When it came to eunuch Deng, Ning Wenfeng had a different opinion. It's actually a good thing that eunuch Deng isn't here. Otherwise, if he wanted us to capture the Duke of Loyalty, what do you think we should do? Disobeying his orders is the same as disobeying the emperor's decree. Which one of us can bear the consequences? And if something happens in the future, he can send us back at any time, but the rest of us will have to suffer. Ancient River's face paled at this reminder, and he inwardly sighed. As expected, he couldn't think as well as Ning Wenfeng, so he modestly asked, "Then what should we do next? Based on what you've said, the Duke of Loyalty is a hot potato that will bring misfortune to whoever takes him over." "Ha, that's about right. Since we now know what sort of status he has, it's better to immediately send him out of Xian City. As for whether he wants to return to Tulu or go to the capital, that's his choice." Ning Wenfeng chuckled, clearly agreeing with Ancient River's analogy. "Send him away? Now. Isn't that a little too hasty?" This time, it was Shi Wanshan who spoke. It was clear that he was somewhat unwilling to part with such a fat piece of meat being delivered to him. He felt that if he didn't do anything, he would be letting down this opportunity that had been thrown at him. Ning Wenfeng could understand what Shi Wanshan was thinking. After all, this was an opportunity. Alas, this bait was too big, so big that they simply couldn't swallow it. If they forcefully swallowed it, it would be delightful for a moment, but soon their stomachs would burst open. Therefore, when he saw that Shi Wanshan was still hesitating, he had no choice but to say, "Commander, this matter can't be delayed. Once eunuch Deng finds out about this and sends someone to pass down the order for us to take action, I'm afraid we won't have any other choice." This reminder caused Shi Wanshan's expression to change. That's right. We should send them away quickly." Seeing that Shi Wanshan had listened to his suggestion, Ning Wenfeng added, "Yes, we'll send them away tomorrow morning and then send someone to inform eunuch Deng in the capital that we don't dare to act on our own. Moreover, the Duke of Loyalty is certain to be in a hurry to leave, so we can't stop him. Thus, we'll leave the matter up to them." Logically speaking, with Shi Wanshan's intelligence, it wasn't that he hadn't thought of these things. It was just that the implications of this matter were too great, and for a moment he was a little fascinated and couldn't extricate himself. Now that he heard this, he immediately made the right choice. Okay, I'll persuade the Duke of Loyalty to leave tomorrow morning. The East Courtyard was still secretly plotting and thinking of a way to deal with this. In the North Courtyard, Beta Persei also came to Yang Qindong's side and asked for instructions. There was another person standing at the side. He was thin, and who else could it be but Shile? Ming didn't return to the capital with Yang Qindong this time, but stayed in the first city area. The sixth young master wasn't here, and the military here also needed a strong person to hold the fort. Ming, who had just become a division commander, obviously had such qualifications. Ming wasn't here, but he had asked Shile to accompany him. It was obvious that Yang Qindong really thought highly of this person's ability. Shile's speech about the people deeply won Yang Qindong's heart. In order to get to know this person better, and also to give him some pointers, Yang Qindong kept him by his side. This action naturally caused Shi Biao to be extremely excited. Shile's mother was Han, and he originally had some Han appearance. Now that he had changed into the Black Knight's clothes, no one could tell that he was originally the Deputy General of Tulu City. And just now, Yang Qindong was talking to him about the current situation. Beta Persei entered the room, first glanced at Shile, nodded as a greeting, and then turned to Yang Qindong and asked, "Young master, the captains asked if we should be fully armed tonight and be ready to fight at any time." "No need." Yang Qindong waved his hand and said decisively, "Then what if this Wanshan has other ideas? If we aren't prepared at all, I'm afraid that we won't be able to guarantee our safety." Beta Persei added anxiously. Usually when he was by Yang Qindong's side, he was very obedient. Usually when Yang Qindong said one, he wouldn't say two. But now the situation was different. They were in someone else's lair, and it was related to the sixth young master's safety, so he had to say more. He also knew that Beta Persei would ask this because he was worried about his safety. Yang Qindong didn't mean to blame him, but said indifferently, "If they really want to fight, do you really think that we can stop their army with just 200 riders? Okay, tell the soldiers to have a good rest today. We still have to travel tomorrow." Chapter 783. Since Yang Qindong had said so, Beta Persei could only nod and say, "Yes, I will arrange it now." After Beta Persei left the room, Yang Qindong glanced at Shibi and said, "Continue what you were saying." "Yes," Shibi replied respectfully, before continuing with the previous topic. "We know a little about Wanshan. He's a smart man. It is because of his intelligence that we will be safer. Unfortunately, the eunuch Deng Chang is not here, so no one can force him to do anything. So as long as he is not crazy, he will definitely not do anything to us." Shibi was indeed very capable. Her analysis was actually consistent with the East Courtyard's view. Yang Qindong nodded in agreement and said, "You just said that we can leave the city tomorrow morning. How can you be so sure?" Replying to the sixth young master, "I will say the same thing. Eunuch Deng Chang is not here, so this is Wanshan's opportunity. Otherwise, once the news spreads, Deng Chang might react and send someone to give instructions. I am afraid that the development of the matter will not be up to Wanshan to decide." Shibi was very mindful of his identity. Although he boasted of being smart in front of Yang Qindong, he would only say what was asked and would not show off. This was because Yang Qindong was a smarter person than he was. After hearing this, Yang Qindong valued Shibi's ability even more. This was exactly the same as the result of his analysis. This was also the reason why he dared to appear in the Xian mansion with only 200 cavalry. His life was indeed valuable, but at the same time, it was also dangerous. Unless Northern Ming, was prepared to shed all pretense of cordiality with the mercenaries. At least on the surface, they wouldn't dare to make a move on him. This gave him a chance to move freely. Well, you must be tired from the journey. Go and have a good rest. I have arranged for people to prepare ginseng soup for you. Remember to drink it when you go back. It is good for your body to recover quickly. Looking at the thin Shibi, Yang Chendong said with concern, "Thank you, sixth young master." She was very excited, and her face was also very touched. The other party's importance and concern in his life made him feel like he was willing to die for someone who knew him well. In his heart, he had already recognized this master and would not change in this life. Just like that, the night passed peacefully and nothing happened. When the sun rose the next morning, Shi Wanshan, with his eyes still bloodshot, appeared outside the northern courtyard. He wanted to see Yang Chendong. Shi Wanshan had already heard from the people in the mansion that the Duke and the 200 cavalry had rested well last night. They had only arranged for 2 soldiers to guard the gate of the northern courtyard and did not do anything else. When he heard this report, Shi Wanshan couldn't help but sigh. This Duke of Loyalty's breadth of mind and his ability to see things clearly was not something ordinary people could compare to. Even he himself, although he had seen through everything because he still wanted to ask for more, he did not rest well last night. His eyes were still bloodshot. His request was approved. When he saw Yang Chendong, he found him practicing martial arts in the courtyard. He looked very energetic. In the snow, Lin Chendong's martial arts caused the snowflakes to float in the air. It gave people a very majestic feeling. The only regret was that Shi Wanshan could not see the origin and style of this set of martial arts. After practicing a set of military martial arts 3 times in a row, Yang Chendong took a hot towel from Beta Persei. After wiping his face, he looked at Shi Wanshan, who was standing there, and said, "Commander Shi, good morning." "Good morning, Duke." With a smile on his face, Shi Wanshan said with a smile. Yang Chendong immediately noticed the bloodshot eyes of Shi Wanshan, but he did not say anything. On the contrary, he could understand the other party. If he was in his position, he would not be able to sleep well tonight. After the 2 sides greeted each other, Shi Wanshan politely invited the Duke to have breakfast together. Logically speaking, Yang Chendong was just a duke, so the other party did not need to be so polite. But because he had something to say, he became the one asking for a favor. Yang Chendong, who was well aware of this, immediately smiled and agreed. After all, he also needed a way out. Otherwise, if he really angered the other party and really made a move, the other party would not have a good ending, but he was afraid that he would not be any better. One had feelings, the other had intentions. The 2 sat at the dining table. Then, when breakfast was almost finished, Shi Wanshan finally brought up the topic of leaving. "Duke, I have some capable people under me. They have some insights into the changes in the weather. According to them, there will be heavy snow in 2 days, which is very inconvenient for traveling." Instead of directly asking Yang Chendong to leave, he found such an excuse. It could be seen that Shi Wanshan also used his brain. Yang Chendong naturally knew the other party's intentions. This happened to coincide with his analysis of the other party yesterday. But at this moment, he still pretended to be very surprised and said, "Is there such a thing? It seems that my plan needs to change. I originally wanted to stay in Shuanqing Prefecture for a few days to enjoy the scenery here, but it seems that I have to leave immediately." Seeing that Yang Chendong had accepted his good intentions, Shi Wanshan was naturally overjoyed, but on the surface he still pretended to urge him to stay, and said, "Why don't you wait until after the snowstorm and then go to the capital?" "Oh, that's not a bad idea." Seeing Shi Wanshan's hypocritical look, Yang Chendong's interest was piqued, and he teased him. As expected, Shi Wanshan's expression changed as soon as he said this. But he had just opened his mouth to urge him to stay, so how could he slap his own mouth? He could only look bitterly at Yang Chendong. Chuckling, Yang Chendong changed the topic. This duke appreciates Commander Wan's good intentions, but I haven't seen my wife for nearly 2 years and miss her very much. I'd better leave first. Oh, right. Since there's a snowstorm, I'm afraid that my cavalry and I will encounter it at any time. For the sake of safety, I'd like to ask Commander Wan to make things convenient and prepare more food for them, such as jerky and wine. The more, the better. Since the other party had asked him to leave, Yang Chendong naturally wanted to take the opportunity to ask for some benefits. Although these things weren't worth much and were only enough for 200 people, it was still enough to disgust the other party. Although the request wasn't high, Shi Wanshan felt a little sick in his heart. Why was it that when his opponent came, not only could he not do anything to him, he had to take out some things to give him as a gift? At this moment, he really wanted to shout angrily that there was nothing he wanted, and if he didn't leave now, he would be caught. But in the end, this was just a thought, and he forcefully suppressed it. Well said, well said. I'll immediately have someone make the arrangements. Sure, Wanshan agreed. Yang Chendong was all smiles, but he was extremely vigilant. If the other party was seething with anger, not only would he not be afraid, he would even understand. But a person who could suppress his true thoughts was the scariest. To avoid any unexpected problems, Yang Chendong had his own goal. After receiving the food from Shi Wanshan and the clearance documents, he left Xuanqing with 200 black cavalry and left the Wangquan Metropolitan Division, heading straight for Huailai City. While Yang Chendong's group was on their way to Baiming's capital, an urgent memorial was being delivered to Baiming's capital. The one who had written this memorial was the commander of the Wangquan Metropolitan Division, Shi Wanshan. Since Yang Chendong had appeared in his territory, he naturally had to report this matter to his superiors as soon as possible. After passing through Huailai, entering the Great Wall, exiting Juyong Pass, Baiming's capital was finally within sight. It had been nearly 2 years since they had parted, and when he thought about his 2 wives, Yang Chendong felt all sorts of emotions well up in his heart. In terms of time, it hadn't even been 2 years since he had left the capital to pay respects to his ancestors, but he had truly accomplished many things. He had defeated the Huang bandits, wiped out the Jiaoji and Lansang kingdoms, and now built a large city on the steppe. This seemed like an impossible task that would have taken many years, but he had accomplished it in a short period of time. Just this achievement alone was enough to leave his name in the annals of history. Even if he were to return home and become a wealthy man or a duke, he would still be able to live a carefree life. But when he thought about how there were still so many Han commoners wandering outside and being bullied by others, and how his descendants would be harassed by foreign tribes, their families destroyed, and they would be reduced to slaves and humiliated, Yang Chendong's heart madly thumped. Since he had come here by chance, he had to do some things. Otherwise, wouldn't he be letting down the heavens? At the very least, I've laid down the foundation. As long as I continue to develop normally, everything will be fine. Everything will change. Encouraging himself, Yang Chendong rode on his white dragon horse and raised its whip, increasing its speed toward Baiming's capital. Baiming's capital. It was still as bustling as ever. Crowds flowed through the streets, and the sounds of hawking could be heard. It was as lively and prosperous as the along the river during the Qingming festival. In contrast, the imperial palace of the capital was in chaos. Several junior eunuchs from the Bureau of Rites had hurriedly led their teams out of the palace to inform the important officials to discuss matters with the emperor. The main reason for this was the urgent report that Shi Wanshan had delivered. Emperor Zhu Qiyu had never imagined that the Duke of Loyalty and Courage, who had given him such a headache and left him helpless, would suddenly appear in the Xuanfu residence. Looking at the report from the commander of the Myriad Affairs Bureau, Shi Wanshan, he realized that this person's goal was the capital of Baiming. When Jining, the head eunuch, hurriedly delivered the memorial to the throne to him, Zhu Qizhen was really startled. He almost jumped up from the dragon throne and cried out in alarm. Chapter 784. Regarding what Yang Qindong had done with the mercenaries in the north, there were naturally regular reports from the spies of the military's brocade guard, which had also provoked Zhu Qiyu's anger and delight. He was angry because of the actions of the mercenaries in the new Ergon capital region. After 3 battles, Baiming's northern guard had lost nearly 20,000 soldiers. He was happy because Yang Qindong's appearance had greatly reduced the military pressure on Baiming in the north. According to the Datong Prefecture's report, even Wali Yeshin's troops that had already occupied the Hetao region had stopped their attacks because of the establishment of the first city and the appearance of the mercenaries. From this, one could see the prestige of Yang Qindong. It was a pity that this person could not only be used by him. If he could, it would not be difficult to defeat the southern Ming Empire and unify the world. Zhu Qiyu touched his forehead as if he had a headache. This small action was seen by Jining, who was standing at the side and serving him. He hurriedly asked with concern, "Your Majesty, are you feeling unwell?" "No. Inform them. The officials should be here soon, right?" Zhu Qiyu shook his head. He thought about why the officials had not arrived yet and asked a few more questions. "I've already informed them. They should be here soon," Jining hurriedly replied. Then he raised his foot and looked outside the hall. Although he could not see anything by doing this, he wanted to use this action to tell the emperor that he was also very anxious. They did not have to wait for long. Soon, a flurry of footsteps sounded outside the hall. Then, the voice of a eunuch was heard. "Your Majesty, Minister of War Ming has arrived. He requests an audience." "Your Majesty, Minister of Justice Su Yozhen has arrived. He requests an audience." All right. Call them all in." Jining had been looking at Zhu Qiyu from the corner of his eyes. Although he did not say anything, his face was already filled with impatience. Thus, he acted on his own initiative and shouted loudly outside. In a short while, the Minister of Personnel Wang Zhi, the Minister of Revenue Jin Lian, the Minister of Rights Hu Chang, the Minister of War Ming, the Minister of Justice Su Yozhen, the Minister of Works Shi Pu, and the Imperial Censor of the Left Chun Yi entered the Imperial Palace and stood in line. In less than 2 years, there were not many changes in Zhu Qiyu's regime. In reality, Baiming didn't seem to have any major issues, and its internal affairs were stable and united. But in reality, it was nothing more than a golden exterior. Zhu Qiyu's ascension to the throne was, after all, a special case. It wasn't a normal ascension to the throne, which caused many people to criticize him. In fact, it had already been 3 years since the defeat of Tu Mu, but there were still people mentioning that matter. The general idea was that since Ingzong was fine, he should have come back to be the emperor instead of going to the southern Ming Empire to be the southern emperor. As a result, the powerful Great Ming Empire was split into 2 halves, and its strength was greatly reduced. There were still people who were doubtful about the position below his, but for this reason, the Genie Guards and the Eastern Palace Guards contributed a lot and arrested a lot of people. On the surface, it seemed to be calm. But once a crisis was discovered, no one could be sure that no one would come out to make trouble. The military had been training new recruits and refining firearms, which were very expensive things. For a time, it caused the Baiming regime to be unable to make ends meet, so that many officials' salaries couldn't be paid in time, which caused many people to complain. External affairs. Needless to say, the southern Ming Empire seemed to be harmonious, but Who knew what kind of thoughts Zhu Qizhen had for his brother who stole the throne? They didn't use it now because of the rampant foreign invasion. But once there was no foreign invasion, there would be a big war to determine the winner. Not to mention, because of the problems in the joint business, the kingdom of Wara was no longer as friendly as before. The other side had even sent troops to occupy the Hatao region, which made the western region restless. At this time, mercenaries came from the northwest, which made the situation more complicated. With all kinds of situations added together, Zhu Qiyu often felt a headache coming on. In such an environment, the ministers naturally didn't move if they could. Otherwise, it would only cause panic and other complicated situations to arise. 6 ministers and a censor of the left were standing in the main hall. They were all puzzled. They couldn't figure out why the emperor was in such a hurry to summon them. It seemed that they had just started the court meeting this morning. At that time, the emperor didn't say anything and just waited for them to return home. Their buttocks hadn't even warmed up from their seats yet, and now they were urgently summoned. Could it be that something urgent had happened? Thinking of this, the expressions of the 7 ministers changed. The first thing they thought of was that the Walla had attacked. Perhaps this was the only thing that could make the emperor so uneasy. Thinking about it, did Ningzong lose to Yeshen? As for why no one thought about the southern Ming Empire and the mercenaries, it was because, in a sense, they were on the same side. Now that the external threat had not been dealt with, there shouldn't be any internal problems. The expressions of the 7 ministers changed one after another, but they were all calm. No one said anything, waiting for the emperor's orders. Zhu Qiyu had long been used to this scene. He also knew that these ministers were all scheming people. Normal things wouldn't be able to provoke them. Good, since it was like this, he would make a move today to provoke them. Jining, let the ministers have a look at the memorial. Yes, Your Majesty. Jining agreed. Holding the memorial that Shi Wanshan had sent, she was the first to walk in front of the Minister of Personnel, Wang Ji. Minister Wang, please have a look. Since ancient times, the officials of the Ministry of Personnel were one level higher than the officials. They were also known as the heavenly official of the Ministry of Personnel. Thus, it was never wrong to let Wang Ji have a look first. Wang Ji nodded his head reservedly. Then he took the memorial and began to read it, but in just a few breaths, his expression kept changing. It was obvious that this memorial must be about something important. Otherwise, the heavenly official of the Ministry of Revenue, who usually didn't show his joy on his face, wouldn't be so nervous and lose his composure. After about 10 breaths, Wang Ji returned the memorial to great eunuch Jining. Then, the memorial was passed down to the Minister of Revenue, Jin Lian. His expression also changed, no different from Wang Ji's earlier expression. After another 10 breaths, the memorial continued to be passed down, and the same thing happened again and again. Zhu Qiyu sat high on the golden dragon throne, carefully observing the changing expressions on the ministers' faces. Every time he saw a minister about to lose his composure, he felt extremely proud. How is it? I must have scared all of you this time. Otherwise, when I lose my composure, you would always lecture me to calm down. Now, look at all of you. How are you going to calm down? In a little more than 10 minutes, the 7 ministers had all read the memorial. Jining returned to Zhu Qiyu's side and stood at the side. The Emperor of Dai Zong's voice resounded through the hall. Everyone has seen the news. Yes? Tell me what you think. The hall was silent. No one immediately responded to the emperor's question, as if they were still digesting the news they had just received. When Zhu Qiyu impatiently asked again, the Minister of Justice, Su Yozhen, finally stood up and said, Your Majesty, may this subject be so bold as to ask, is this news true? Could it be someone pretending to be the Duke of loyalty and courage. It was no wonder that Su Yozhen would ask such a question. Yang Qindong was no longer the same as before. In the battle to defend the capital after Tumu's defeat, Yang Qindong had stepped forward and led the so-called mercenaries to defeat the menacing Yeshin's Wara army. At the time, he had a reason to say that this army didn't belong to him because he had saved someone, and that person just so happened to be the leader of the mercenaries. Now, it seemed that this was just a story. All kinds of evidence had already shown that the so-called leader of the mercenaries was none other than Yang Qindong himself. This had long been reported from the southern Ming Empire, and according to the investigations of the Baiming Brocade Guard and the East Faction Guards, the mercenaries were very powerful and should have an overseas base. It was only because most of the great Ming Empire ships were in the southern Ming Empire that they couldn't investigate. But in any case, it was more or less confirmed that Yang Qindong was the leader of the mercenaries. Then why did Yang Qindong appear in Baiming's capital at this time? Didn't he know that this method was no different from entering the tiger's den? This was tantamount to delivering oneself to be slaughtered. Su Yozhen was the first to be chosen by Yang Qindong and spent a lot of effort to support him to become a minister. He really couldn't understand the meaning behind Yang Qindong's actions, which was why he asked this question. Most importantly, he didn't receive any information in advance this time. He was a spy. Su Yozhen couldn't figure it out and couldn't understand it. He wasn't the only one. The other ministers also had the same thought. At least in their view, if they were in the same situation, they would never appear in Baiming's capital. If they had to appear, they would have to bring an army. Only when the soldiers were at the city gates would they have the power to deter others. Finally, someone spoke. Zhu Qiyu nodded in satisfaction and said to Su Yozhen, "Minister Su, Commander Shi has seen the Duke of Loyalty before. Since he has submitted a memorial, he wouldn't joke about such a matter. It seems that it is the Duke of Loyalty." Since the Emperor had said so, even if Su Yozhen had doubts, he couldn't say anything about this matter. He could only nod and return to his seat. If the person who came was really the Duke of Loyalty, then he needed to think about what to do next. There was no need for him to immediately express his opinion. Su Yozhen retreated. Minister of War Ming stepped out from his seat and said, "Your Majesty, if the person who came is really the Duke of Loyalty, this subject requests that you interrogate him properly. At the same time, have him hand over the command of the mercenaries to my Baiming. If this happens, my Baiming's military strength will greatly increase. At that time, whatever Walla or Yes Hen, they will no longer be our opponents. Not only that, we also have a high chance of recovering the Southern Ming Empire and unifying the world." You're tuning in to the Mystic Fist YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.